Chapter 1. The Summons at Dawn. It was on a bleak February morning of the year 1893 that I was once more drawn, by the irresistible current of fate, into the orbit of my remarkable friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. London lay wrapped beneath a shroud of fog so dense that even the gas lamps burned like dim, ghostly globes behind veils of vapor, and the steady drip of moisture from the eaves beat a dreary accompaniment to the clatter of hooves upon the cobbles. I had risen early that morning, for sleep had been elusive. The old wound from my service in Afghanistan had troubled me more than usual, a reminder of how time exacts its quiet toll. Mary had been gone now these 2 years, and though I had resumed my practice in Kensington, there were hours, such as that dawn, when the solitude pressed in with oppressive familiarity. It was at such a moment, as I stood by the window with a cup of tepid tea, that the sharp rattle of the knocker at my door startled me from my reverie. My landlady entered, her face pale and startled. "There's a messenger here, sir. Says it's urgent. From Baker Street." At once my heart quickened. Baker Street. The address alone was enough to stir a flood of memories, of long nights spent in pursuit of impossible enigmas, of Holmes's violin murmuring through the fog, of strange visitors with darker secrets than London's alleys could hold. "Show him up," I said, already reaching for my coat. The messenger, a young boy of the district telegraph service, entered with a quick bow. "Message for Dr. Watson, sir, from Mr. Sherlock Holmes." He handed me a folded note, the handwriting unmistakably Holmes's, thin, precise, and severe. "My dear Watson, your presence is required at once. A matter of singular urgency and interest. Come immediately. S.H." No more, no less. I scarcely needed further encouragement. Within a quarter of an hour I was wrapped in my greatcoat, my revolver discreetly pocketed, for with Holmes one never knew what circumstances might arise, and seated in a hansom cab bound for 221B Baker Street. The familiar facade came into view through the fog like a ship emerging from mist. The old rooms had scarcely changed. Mrs. Hudson's industrious polish glowed on the banister, and the faint, comforting scent of pipe tobacco hung in the air like incense in a chapel. Holmes was standing before the fireplace when I entered, tall and lean as ever, his eyes glittering beneath the shadow of his brow. The morning light, such as it was, played upon his aquiline features and the angular outline of his profile. On the mantel beside him lay a heap of papers, a magnifying lens, and what appeared to be a small bone fragment enclosed within a handkerchief. "My dear Watson," he exclaimed with genuine warmth, "you have not lost your military promptness. I estimated that you would require precisely 20 minutes to arrive, yet here you stand in 17. Excellent. You wrote that it was urgent," I replied. "Has something occurred?" He gestured for me to sit. "Something, yes. Whether it be crime, tragedy, or curiosity remains to be seen. But first let us fortify ourselves with coffee. Mrs. Hudson, if you please." When the good woman had withdrawn, Holmes settled into his armchair, steepling his fingers. "You recall perhaps the old Aldwych Library?" he asked. "The one off the Strand?" "Yes, a curious old edifice, built over the foundations of a monastic house, if memory serves." "Just so," said Holmes, with a spark of interest. "Founded in 1673 upon the crypt of St. Cyprian's Monastery, whose records were lost in the Great Fire. The crypt remains intact beneath the modern structure, though few are permitted to enter it. The librarian, a certain Mr. Edmund Harcourt, is the only man who holds the key." He rose and crossed to the window. "At dawn this morning Harcourt was found dead at his desk." "Dead?" I exclaimed. "Under what circumstances?" "Ah, that, my dear Watson, is precisely the point. His body was discovered by the night porter, one Thomas Griggs, who states that he found the library door locked from within. No sign of struggle, no weapon, no mark upon the man's person. Yet his expression was one of such abject terror as to freeze the blood. His hand was clenched about this." Holmes unwrapped the handkerchief. Within lay a fragment of bone, human by its shape, with something carved upon it. I leaned closer. "It appears to be a letter," I murmured. "An M, perhaps?" "Possibly." The carving was made with a sharp instrument, recently applied. You note the fresh scoring of the edges. Moreover, this bone, though human, is not Harcourt's own. Of that I am certain. He smiled faintly at my astonishment. A trifling observation, Watson. The bone belongs to the tibia of a person no older than 20. Harcourt was 63. But how do you know? The density of the structure, my dear fellow. Observe the porosity, the fine lightness of the grain. A man of Harcourt's age would show far greater calcification. He turned abruptly. Now consider this. The crypt beneath the library is sealed by an iron door. Harcourt alone possessed the key, which remains in his pocket. Yet the porter swears that he heard sounds beneath the floor shortly before discovering the body. Sounds like whispering. Whispering, I repeated incredulously. Indeed. You begin to see why I found the affair stimulating. Holmes drew on his pipe thoughtfully, filling the air with slow, fragrant spirals of smoke. There is more, he continued. The police, represented by our old friend Inspector Lestrade, have concluded that the man died of natural causes, heart failure brought on by fright. But I am not satisfied. Death leaves its own fingerprints, Watson, and these I intend to examine myself. He rose suddenly and began pacing the room with quick, nervous strides. There is something profoundly theatrical about this case. A dead librarian clutching a bone inscribed with a letter. A sealed crypt beneath a library, whispers in the night. Were it not for the tangible evidence, one might dismiss it as a Gothic fancy. I could not help but smile. And you suspect foul play? Holmes paused. I suspect curiosity. He turned to me with that peculiar light that always heralded a new chase. You recall the case of the Musgrave ritual? This may prove of a similar nature, a secret hidden beneath the floorboards of history. But let us not speculate prematurely. I have arranged for us to meet Lestrade at the Aldwych Library within the hour. Will you accompany me? Of course. Excellent. Bring your medical bag, Watson. I may require your opinion upon the condition of the corpse. Also, your revolver. Do you expect danger? Holmes smiled thinly. I expect the unexpected. And that, as you know, is the most perilous expectation of all. An hour later we were rattling through the mist-choked streets in a cab, the horses' hooves striking the stones like muffled drum beats. The library loomed before us soon enough, a grand brooding structure of soot-darkened stone, its entrance framed by iron lamps that flickered feebly against the grey morning. A small knot of constables stood near the door, their breath steaming in the chill air. Lestrade met us inside, his sharp features pinched with fatigue. Morning, Mr. Holmes. Dr. Watson. Nasty business, this. You'll find the body just as we discovered it. We followed him through a corridor lined with shelves that rose like walls of shadow. The silence was immense, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards and the whisper of our own footsteps. The librarian's office lay at the end of a narrow passage. Harcourt sat slumped over his desk, his spectacles askew, his head bowed upon his folded arms. His expression, as Lestrade had said, was ghastly, the lips drawn back, the eyes half open, as though he had glimpsed something that reason could not endure. Holmes leaned close, his face impassive. "Remarkable," he murmured. "Watson, note the dilation of the pupils. Death was sudden, but not instantaneous." He straightened and examined the room with swift, darting glances. The unlit lamp, the open ledger, the faint smell of mildew. His gaze paused upon the floorboards near the desk, where a faint line of dust had been disturbed. "Lestrade," said Holmes quietly, "have you examined beneath the floor?" "The floor? No, why should we?" "Because, my dear Inspector," Holmes said, crouching with a smile that did not reach his eyes, "the good Mr. Harcourt was not alone when he died." Chapter 2. The Shadow Beneath the Stacks. If there is one faculty in which Mr. Sherlock Holmes surpassed even the renowned detectives of fiction, it was not as many, suppose, the brilliance of his conclusions, but the scrupulous respect he paid to the shy, whispering details that most men overlook. while Lestrade and I remained transfixed by the ghastly mask of death upon Edmund Harcourt's features. Holmes, like a lean, noiseless hound on the scent, had already drifted to his knees, and was peering with half-closed lids along the boards at the librarian's feet. "You have not examined the floor," he repeated softly, as if the wood itself might answer. "It is the floor, Inspector, which most scrupulously examines us." Lestrade, who tolerated Holmes's aphorisms with the patient martyrdom of a man who knows them to be justified, clicked his tongue. "If there's a trap, you may be sure the yard will find it." Holmes did not trouble to respond. He lifted the corner of a worn Eastern rug whose muted reds had been dulled by years of London grime. Beneath, the boards showed a lattice of dust interrupted by a pale rectangle, as clean as if a cloth had been dragged across it. At one edge of this rectangle protruded a small iron ring, blackened with age and very nearly the same tone as the surrounding wood. It would have escaped any eyes but his. He murmured. "There is our theatre trap." Lestrade crouched with a grunt. "Well, I'll fetch a crowbar." "No need for violence," said Holmes. "Watson, oblige me." He placed my hand upon the iron ring and guided my fingers to a smoothness of metal foreign to its corroded neighbors, the unmistakable polish of frequent contact. The ring lifted without a squeak, and the section of floor to which it was fixed rose like the lid of a chest. A square of darkness opened at our feet, exhaling a breath that was not the honest damp of London's undercellars, but a dry mineral cold, as if one had unstoppered a jar of ancient air. "Hold the lantern, Inspector," said Holmes. Lestrade brought the light forward, and we saw that a short flight of wooden steps descended into the void. The vertical face of the lowest step displayed scratch marks and abrasions, mute testimony to recent passage, and along the rises were beads of wax, caught and hardened in their descent. Holmes inspected one such tier of wax with his lens and broke a small fragment free with a penknife. "Sealing wax," he observed. "Red, but not of our ordinary commerce. You will note the grain, Inspector. A Spanish resin, I should say, with a trace of cinnabar. I have met its like in ecclesiastical seals." Lestrade sniffed. "Harcourt was a librarian, not a bishop." "A librarian," returned Holmes, "whose institution stands upon a monastic crypt. One must never blind oneself to historical continuity. I would wager that the traditions of St. Cyprian still breathe in the stone below, and that some gentlemen of our acquaintance have been courting antiquity with improper ardour." He knelt once more, this time not to the ring, but to the dust that skirted it. "Observe, Watson." I did so, but could make little of the fine disturbances to which he pointed. A faint scuff in one direction, a sharper dig at the edge of the board, a smear of something pale that might have been chalk. "You perceive," he continued, "that two persons, not one, have lately passed through this trap. The heavier man, note the deeper impress upon the third tread, descended first. The lighter followed. He carries his weight upon the forefoot. The mark is narrow, and he turns the toe outward. Moreover, he drew a folded paper from his pocket, a flake of mortar, fresh and from a curved surface. We shall place that in our pocketbook of trifles." Lestrade grunted again, but his skepticism was fraying. "If there were two, where is the second? We have only the librarian above." "Precisely," said Holmes. "Let us descend." He took the lantern in one hand, and with the other motioned me to follow. The steps gave a complaining creak beneath our weight. At the bottom, our light spilled into a narrow passage, low-roofed and lined with brick. The air here was very still, and the sound of distant London seemed to withdraw as one might draw a curtain. Our lantern threw ahead of us a moving canopy of shadows. We walked beneath it as one walks under trees at night. The passage ran straight for some 7 yards, and then gave upon a door of iron set into masonry, black with age. The door was of the simplest pattern, a rectangular plate strapped with bands, yet the lock which fastened it was of unusual fineness. I saw at once that it did not belong to the door as originally made, but had been added later. The stone around the lock was chipped and bright, the work recent. Upon the lintel above, the soot of hundreds of lamps had deepened to a sable patina, yet there were clean crescents in it, as if a hand had brushed away the deposit in 2 swift strokes. Holmes, whose eye missed nothing, lifted the lantern. "The door has been opened lately," said he, and the man who opened it was careful. He wiped his hand after the deed, not before. "How the deuce?" began Lestrade. "The arc of the clean soot cuts from right to left, with the broader sweep outward. A left-hander, Inspector, but we run ahead. First let us reconcile something nearer to hand." He stooped and examined the floor immediately before the door. The flagstones showed a scatter of pale dust, irregular but not random. Here and there were specks of a darker nature, a fragment of black thread, a grain of rust, a breath of white that crushed to powder under his nail and smelt faintly of aromatic gum. "Frankincense," he said, "or a cheap cousin. We are, it seems, amid those who treasure ritual." He dropped to one knee so suddenly that I started, and carefully teased free from a crack between the stones a minuscule shaving of metal, bright as a fish scale. "You see this, Watson? It appears to be brass. Yellow metal, certainly, from a key. Not from the key that fits this lock, however. Observe the slight curvature. Our intruder's key slipped. Perhaps it turned poorly in a ward not intended to receive it. When indentations tell you what voice was speaking, it is pedantry to demand the whole speech." Lestrade could contain himself no longer. "And where is the key that does fit?" Holmes's eyes flicked to me. "In Harcourt's pocket, if the porter did not err. Pray, Inspector, keep your zeal somewhat leashed, for while you might break this door and satisfy the curiosity which is gnawing you, you would at the same blow frighten away the timid bird we hope to snare. There is a better way." He stood back and regarded the lock with the reflective tenderness he accorded all mechanisms. Then, producing a small leather case from within his coat, he selected 2 slender instruments and tickled the keyhole with the most delicate insinuation. I had seen him perform such feats upon occasion, but never with more gentleness. It was as if a physician were coaxing a stubborn pulse. In a moment there came a whisper, the sound of a tongue relaxing, and the door yielded a finger's breadth. Holmes neither opened it further nor attempted to peer within. He contented himself with listening, and I with him. There was nothing, only the massed silence of stone. "Watson," he whispered, "your hand, if you please." I extended it, and he deposited upon my palm a small irregular lump, the shaving of yellow metal. "Keep that. We shall return it to its proper home in due time." Lestrade was swaying with impatience. "If there's a catacomb on the other side, we had best see it, and announce ourselves to whoever still lingers within." Holmes gave his thin smile. "No, Inspector. We content ourselves with knowledge, not conquest, for now." He closed the door softly, and the lock resumed its former severity. "Before we go above," said he, "let us complete our promenade." The passage continued some yards beyond the iron door, narrowing until the lantern's light showed us a cul-de-sac where the brickwork met older stone. Here, scattered across the floor, lay a litter of trifles such as a careless workman might leave. Splinters of wood, a length of twine, a chip of slate. But Holmes's hand went unerringly to that which to me seemed least, a shred of paper so worn and translucent it clung to his glove. He held it to the light. The ghost of a stamp impressed upon wax showed there. A bird, perhaps, with a beak inclined to the breast. "A pelican," he said, "feeding her young with her own blood. A medieval emblem of sacrifice. One finds her upon the seals of certain learned societies that fancy themselves ancient." He folded the shard and consigned it to the same book of trifles as the brass shaving. "Learned societies," Lestrade repeated. "What have they to do with a dead librarian?" "Everything or nothing," said Holmes lightly. "I keep my mind in a state of healthy suspense." We returned to the librarian's office by the same way, closing the trap and restoring the rug as we had found it. Harcourt still presided over his desk. Death had not released the rictus of his expression. I confess that the sight struck me anew, and that I turned away, for mortuary pictures are never improved by repetition. Holmes, however, was not done with the room itself. He drew the curtains, to Lestrade's protest, and shut out the winter daylight. Then he darkened the wick of the lamp and relit it, adjusting the chimney with surgical exactness, so that the flame burned straight and blue. When he was satisfied, he held a sheet of paper above the chimney until the warm air breathed against it. "This will do. Bring me the ledger." Lestrade fetched the open volume. Its last entry had been written in a firm librarian's hand. "Miss Cipriani." The dash trailed off, and the pen had scored an ugly hook as if snatched away. "You see the blot?" said Holmes. Not at the terminus of the line, where a startled hand would naturally stumble, but here. He pointed with a pencil to a faint swelling of ink a word earlier. He was interrupted at Cipriani, not at the dash. The catalogue entry is incomplete. The dash is a librarian's habit, not alarm. He then drew from his pocket a vial and dabbed a single drop upon the paper. A message, of which I could make no sense, lifted itself in a faint brown bloom beneath the entry, a string of numerals, 17-4 to 12, followed by a symbol like a cross within a circle. "It was written in sympathetic ink," I cried. "Not so," Holmes returned. "It is the mere heat drawing out the vestiges of the erasure. Harcourt wrote something and thought better of it. He rubbed it out, but not to my satisfaction." "What do the numbers mean?" asked Lestrade. "Press marks," said Holmes. "The language of librarians. Stair B, Bay 17, Shelf 4, Item 12, or something close to it. We shall confirm below." He moved to the wall where a series of narrow drawers were labelled with neat letters. Sliding one open, he revealed a regiment of cards, each bearing the title of a manuscript or folio, with its corresponding press mark in the librarian's minute script. The card Cipriani, if such existed, should have sat between Simon and Iphigenia and Cyrus, tracts upon the wars of. Yet there was a slight gap there, as perceptible to his order as a missing tooth to a dentist. "You saw that at once, Holmes?" I asked. "At once," he said. "More. I observed the faintest rim of dust upon the lip of the gap and the smeared charcoal of a fingertip beside it. Someone removed the card within the last day. Our man is no reader, but a stagehand. He manages props." Lestrade made a satisfied sound. "Then we have him. We summon all the staff and discover who has been playing stagehand." Holmes's eyelids drooped. "We summon no one. Yet. Inspector, I desire first a word with the night porter. Dr. Watson will examine Mr. Harcourt, whose body deserves the respect of professional attention. Afterward, I shall join you both in the reading room, where I expect to find the bay that corresponds to 17-4 to 12. Lestrade departed in search of the porter, and I set about my melancholy duty. I will not weary the reader with the full particulars of my examination. Suffice it to say that while there was no lesion of the heart which could wholly account for the suddenness of the man's end, neither did I discover those signs of apoplexy or convulsion that would clinch the theory of natural death. There was, however, a faint pall of some aromatic upon his whiskers, akin to the ghost of frankincense we had sniffed below, and a peculiar dryness about the mucosa, which I have encountered after a man has breathed for some time in an atmosphere vitiated of its ordinary balance. I set down these notes because they became meaningful later, though at the time they troubled me without leading to any conclusion. Holmes, meanwhile, had opened the desk drawers with the delicacy of a pianist. From one he lifted a bunch of keys upon a chain, small, austere, and honest in their wear. He selected one with a narrow bow. "The crypt key," he said, and I saw that it was not brass but iron, and that its wards were cut with archaic severity. "Then the shaving you found," I began, "does not belong to this key," he finished, smiling. "No, Watson, it belongs to a second, unauthorized key. One made to imitate the iron in its wards, but in softer metal. Such a key would deform under stress, hence our shred of yellow. He replaced the chain and closed the drawer without a sound. Then he crossed to the bookshelf in the corner, where a miscellany of volumes shared space with a brass candlestick and a clay bowl in which a grey residue reposed. He touched the residue and lifted a pinch to his nose. Charcoal and myrrh. Our librarian was either devout or tormented by mice. At that moment Lestrade returned with the porter, a gaunt man with the pallid brow, and frayed cuffs of one who lives on tea and little else. His hat was clutched to his chest as if it were a child. "This is Thomas Griggs," said Lestrade. "Tell Mr. Holmes what you told me." Griggs licked his lips. "It were about 3 o'clock, sir. I were making my round when I heard it. A whispering, like below. Not words, sir. Just, well, as if the stone had a breath in it. I was that afeard I was. Then I thought of Mr. Harcourt, and I goes to his door and taps. No answer. I tries the handle. It's locked from the inside. I fetches Inspector Lestrade." Holmes watched him with hooded eyes. "You are new to the post, Mr. Griggs." "Yes, sir. A fortnight only. You sleep in a little room at the back with a kettle on, the hob and a picture of a woman upon the mantel. Not a wife, but a sister. She sews for a draper's." Griggs gaped, and I confess I smiled, for this was my friend in his most playful vein. "Your boots," Holmes continued, "are freshly cobbled, but the right heel sits low and you favour it. The sister's portrait shares a frame with another, now removed. The string marks upon the wallpaper show it. You are honest, Mr. Griggs, and will do very well if you avoid gin." The man bobbed, half terrified, half gratified. Lestrade's pen scratched in his notebook. "And the whispering," Griggs' Adam's apple worked. "Beg pardon, sir, but there's queer things down there. In the mornings sometimes, afore dawn, when the fog creeps into the gratings, it sounds like Latin, sir." "Latin," repeated Holmes mildly. "How learned of the stone. Thank you, Mr. Griggs. You will remain within call." When the porter had gone, Lestrade burst out. "Well, Mr. Holmes, you have your ghost beneath the floor and your priestly wax. What do you make of it?" Holmes turned the ledger so that the faint numerals caught the light again. "I make of it a gentleman of leisure with a brass duplicate key and a smattering of liturgy, a librarian whose last conscious act was not fear but correction, and a crypt to which a door of iron gives entry and I think exit." "Exit?" I cried. "But the trap shows 2 entered and none came out." "Pardon me," said Holmes, and he lifted once more the corner of the rug. "2 entered here, certainly, but one might leave by another path. The crypt is no rabbit hole made yesterday. It is the artery of an older London. When a man is determined to go unseen, he does not return by the door that announced him." He looked at his watch. "Inspector, I must request your indulgence. Close the librarian's office. Permit Dr. Watson to conclude his observations, and meet me in the reading room in half an hour. I would see Bay 17, Shelf 4. Also, send a constable to the Strand for a small parcel to be brought from my rooms in Baker Street. Mrs. Hudson will deliver it if he gives her this note." He scribbled rapidly and tore the page away. "We shall stage our own little ritual this afternoon." "What ritual?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes's eyes glinted. "One which employs red wax and the peculiar susceptibility of dust to arithmetic. If we are fortunate, it will summon not spirits, but feet." He turned to me, and for the briefest instant I saw in his face that inward withdrawal which signalled a thought of consequence, a single straw plucked from 1,000 and weighed. When I ventured the question that hovered on my lips, he waved it aside with a quiet, almost affectionate impatience. "Later, Watson. There is a discrepancy which pleases me. When a thing pleases me, I would have it to myself for a little while. Come, the stacks await." We left the office, together. As we stepped into the long nave of the reading room, the hush of the place closed about us like the nave of a church. Students and clerks bent over their desks beneath the solemn guardianship of shelves that ascended into the gloom. The lamps hung like captive moons, and the card catalogue in its oaken chest might have been a reliquary. Through the far windows the fog pressed its pale face and peered in with wide, unblinking eyes. Holmes paused upon the threshold and, with one of those swift, all-embracing glances, took in the field of his future operations. He inhaled with satisfaction, as a man might draw the bouquet of an old claret. "Remark the smell, Watson. Books, to be sure. Books, and something else. An odor of wet stone and faint incense. Our friends below are not content to remain below. They have begun to climb." He smiled, that thin sardonic line which in him was as good as a fanfare, and set off between the stacks toward Bay 17. I followed, a shiver running through me that had nothing to do with the February air, for there are times when London's heart seems to beat not in the crowded streets, but in its forgotten arteries. And I, who have seen men die, confess that I found the whisper of a crypt beneath a library a grimmer prospect than any alleyway brawl. Yet with Holmes before me, his coat-tails cutting a decisive path, I felt the familiar bracing of courage, and the curious guilty thrill of a man who knows that the theatre's curtain is about to rise. Holmes did not look back, but I knew from the set of his shoulders that he had seen what I had not yet seen, and heard what I had not yet heard. And in that instant I understood that, whatever friend or fiend had shared Edmund Harcourt's last hour, Mr. Sherlock Holmes had already made his acquaintance, by the simple expedient of listening to the floor. Chapter 3. The Manuscript of St. Cyprian. We passed in silence between the towering stacks of the Aldwych Library, Holmes leading the way with the noiseless step of a cat upon velvet. The air was close, heavy with the odor of leather bindings and dust, that peculiar perfume of learning which, once inhaled, clings to the memory as surely as incense to a cassock. The dim globes of the reading lamps threw trembling circles of light upon the oaken desks, where a few early scholars bent over their tomes, oblivious to our passage. Bay 17 lay in the northern aisle, near a row of windows whose opaque glass admitted only the most reluctant light. The shelves rose so high that even the tallest of men could not reach their summits without a ladder. Labels in faded gilt mark the arrangement of the collection: theological tracts, monastic histories, and obscure treatises in Latin and Greek. Holmes halted before the fourth shelf, and with a fingertip traced the numbered sequence. 6, he murmured. 8, 10, 12. He drew forth a volume bound in mottled calfskin, its spine unmarked save for a small cipher impressed in gold. As he tilted it toward the light, a faint cloud of dust escaped, like breath from a long-sealed crypt. "Manuscriptus Cypriani," he read aloud. "No catalogue card, you note, Watson. And yet here it rests. Curious." I leaned nearer. The book was heavy, its pages thick with age. Upon the cover was stamped a circular seal, the same pelican emblem we had seen in fragment below, its wings spread protectively above 3 fledglings. Holmes regarded it in silence for a moment, then produced his lens. "Observe, Watson. The clasp is not original to the binding. It has been affixed within the last 5 years. See the brighter tooling and the foreign alloy. Someone wished to secure this volume. And yet," said I, "they did not lock it." Holmes smiled faintly. "Locks, my dear fellow, are for the honest." He opened the cover. The first page bore an inscription in Latin, written in a hand of exquisite precision. Beneath it was a date, Anno Domini 1671. The ink had faded to sepia, but the words were legible enough. "In memoriam fratrum Cypriani, quod sub terris latet, ne revelitur nisi per sanguinem et lumen." "Your Latin is less rusty than mine, Watson. Translate." I hesitated. "It reads, In memory of the brothers of Cyprian, what lies beneath the earth shall not be revealed save through blood and light." Holmes's eyebrows rose. A charming sentiment for a theological manuscript. He turned the pages delicately, revealing an assortment of curious diagrams, concentric circles, geometric symbols, and passages of cipher that bore no resemblance to Latin or Greek. In the margins were annotations in a later hand, written with a clerk's neatness, but an anxious pressure that bit into the paper. Lestrade, who had joined us with the uneasy expression of a man in a museum of sorcery, shifted his weight. "Looks like nonsense to me. Drawings and gibberish. What would a librarian want with that?" "Everything, Inspector," said Holmes quietly. "A man who guards secrets for a living must eventually fall prey to their charm." He pointed to a marginal note. "See here. Written in English, mid-19th century. The seal beneath remains intact. None must descend without the key of Mercury." "What do you make of that, Watson?" "The seal beneath. It must refer to the crypt below." "Precisely. And the key of Mercury, I take that to be figurative. Perhaps a cipher key, perhaps something more tangible." In either case, Harcourt knew of this note. His final entry in the ledger shows he was about to catalogue the manuscript anew. Why then was he interrupted? Because someone wished to prevent him from doing so. He closed the book and tapped the cover lightly. "This, gentlemen, is the motive. Not greed, not violence, but much secrecy." Lestrade's lips pursed. "And what's to be? Gained by hiding an old monk's scribbles?" Holmes replaced the volume carefully upon the shelf. "I suspect, Inspector, that our scribbles conceal something rather less ecclesiastical. But conjecture is premature. Let us see whether the library itself will offer corroboration." We proceeded to the central desk, where a young assistant was entering data into a ledger with the earnestness of one newly employed. Holmes addressed him in a tone both courteous and commanding. "My good fellow, the late Mr. Harcourt maintained several private drawers in his care, did he not?" The youth blinked. "Yes, sir, but for restricted manuscripts. And access to them was permitted only by his personal key." "Indeed, sir. Though he sometimes allowed the Reverend Mr. Merridew to consult certain volumes." "Reverend Merridew?" The assistant nodded. "A clergyman attached to St. Luke's in Holborn. He comes often, every Thursday evening. He and Mr. Harcourt were much engaged upon some joint study. Antiquarian, I believe." Holmes exchanged a glance with me that required no translation. "You have rendered us a service," he said, slipping the young man a coin. "When next you see the Reverend Merridew, observe whether he walks with his left hand upon the rail." The clerk looked puzzled, but thanked him and resumed his work. As we withdrew, Lestrade muttered, "Left hand? You're thinking of the fellow who opened the door below." "Indeed. We have established a possibility. Now we require proof." Holmes led us to a table at the far end of the room, where the air felt perceptibly colder. From his pocket he drew a small parcel, recently delivered by a constable. Within lay a coil of thin twine, a strip of paper smeared with lampblack, and a small brass weight. "A child's toy?" asked Lestrade. "A philosopher's," replied Holmes. "Observe." He tied the weight to one end of the twine, passed the paper through a loop, and set the device upon the floor. Then, using the ash from his cigarette, he sprinkled a fine dust in a semicircle about the spot. "Now we wait." "For what?" I inquired. "For motion. Dust is a marvelous listener, Watson. It hears what men would hide." He straightened and resumed his seat, outwardly at ease. But I, who knew the nuances of his temperament, perceived the contained excitement that shone beneath the calm. He was in that instant as alert as a violin string drawn taut. Lestrade shifted again. "I don't see—" A faint tremor ran through the twine. The brass weight quivered, then stilled. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "You see it now, Inspector. A draught, slight but constant, rising from beneath the floor. The reading room, therefore, communicates with the crypt. Then there's another entrance? Evidently, and I believe our man knows it well." He knelt once more and examined the edge of the nearest skirting board. "Ah, as I thought. The grain is newer here. This section has been lifted within the year." With the slender blade of his penknife, he pried the board outward. Behind it, instead of the solid plaster we expected, there yawned a narrow aperture, from which exhaled that same dry, cold breath we had felt below. A spiral of dust floated outward like smoke. Holmes held the lantern close. "A passage, Watson, narrow as a chimney, yet sufficient for a man determined to descend." Lestrade bent beside him, incredulous. "And where does it go?" "Where all secrets go, Inspector. Downward." He rose, replaced the board with meticulous care, and brushed the dust from his fingers. We shall not announce this discovery just yet. There is virtue in allowing the spider to believe his web unbroken. We left the library under the pale wash of a waning afternoon. The fog had thickened, pressing low upon the roofs and curling about the lamp-posts, like the tendrils of some spectral seaweed. As we stepped into our cab, Holmes remained silent, his gaze fixed upon the middle distance. At last he spoke. "Watson, have you observed that the Reverend Meridew's church, St. Luke's, lies scarcely a quarter of a mile from the Aldwych Library?" I had not thought of it. Nor had Lestrade, which is to our advantage. I shall call upon the reverend gentleman this evening. You, meanwhile, will oblige me by returning to the library at dusk and keeping a discreet watch upon its entrance. Should anyone enter after closing, note the hour and signal a passing constable. I stared. You expect our man to return? Holmes's lips curved in that humorless smile of his. The lure of secrecy, my dear Watson, is stronger than fear, and far more punctual. He tapped the side of the cab. Until 7, then. Keep your revolver handy. It was close upon 6 when I took my position across the street from the library. The lamps had been lit, but the fog rendered their glow a pale smudge in the dark. The last of the patrons drifted out one by one, until the porter himself emerged and locked the gate. Silence fell, save for the rhythmic clop of a constable's boots along the pavement. An hour passed. The cold gnawed at my fingers despite my gloves, and I began to doubt the wisdom of Holmes's plan. Then, from the shadow of the alley opposite, a figure detached itself, tall, cloaked, moving with deliberate caution. The man paused by the gate, glanced about, and produced a key. A moment later he was inside. I stepped from my post and hailed the constable. "That man! He has entered unlawfully. This way." We crossed the street together, but by the time we reached the door, the figure had vanished within. I pressed my ear to the wood. From deep inside came a sound, faint, rhythmic, like the distant striking of metal on stone. Holmes had been right. The intruder had returned to the crypt. 10 minutes later we were joined by Holmes himself, his lean face pale with excitement. "Excellent, Watson. You have flushed our quarry. The constable will remain here. You and I shall follow." He produced from his pocket a coil of fine wire and a small lantern, then turned the key the constable had procured from the porter. The door opened silently. The vast reading room lay in darkness, save for a single lamp that burned low upon the distant desk. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and carried the faint sweetness of incense. Holmes motioned me to silence and advanced. We moved between the shelves like shadows, our steps muffled by the carpet. Presently a thin line of light appeared beneath the skirting board, where we had earlier discovered the hidden aperture. Holmes knelt beside it and pressed his ear to the wood. From beyond came the unmistakable sound of movement, cautious, measured, accompanied by a faint murmur of words in an unknown tongue. Holmes's eyes met mine. "Latin," he whispered, "but not the Latin of the church. Listen. It is the cadence of a chant." We crouched there in the gloom, the lamplight painting our faces in spectral hues, while beneath us the voice continued, low, rhythmic, and dreadful. Then abruptly there came a metallic click, as of a key turning in an ancient lock, followed by the slow groan of iron hinges. Holmes rose. "The crypt door, Watson. Our man has entered the underworld." He extinguished the lantern, his voice no more than a breath. "Now we follow." Chapter the 4. The Reverend of St. Luke's. The following morning broke bleak and sullen, with a drizzle that blurred the outlines of the chimneys and rendered the pavements treacherous with mud. The very sky seemed reluctant to stir. I confess that after the night's adventure, our descent into the reading room, the muffled chant beneath the floor, and the vanishing of the intruder into that infernal depth, I had slept little. I had, however, the consolation of knowing that Holmes, with his peculiar constitution of steel and mercury, had probably not slept at all. Indeed, when I entered our sitting room at Baker Street, I found him precisely as I had imagined, stretched upon the settee in his dressing gown, long fingers interlaced beneath his chin, the cold gleam of calculation in his eyes. The air was thick with the fumes of shag tobacco and the faint sweetness of the chemical reek that accompanied his more delicate experiments. "Ah, Watson," said he without turning his gaze from the ceiling, "you slept well, I trust?" "Not in the least," I replied. "You expected him to return, and he did. Yet he escaped us." Holmes smiled thinly. "Escaped, yes, but not unseen. While you were at your post, I had the good fortune to make a small detour to St. Luke's. There I made the acquaintance of our Reverend Mr. Merridew. You've seen him already? At first light, a most obliging gentleman, quiet, scholarly, with the complexion of one who spends too many hours in the vestry and too few in the sun. Yet his left cuff bore a smear of red wax, identical in composition to that we found upon the steps of the crypt. You tested it? With nitric solution. Quite conclusive. Moreover, he wears upon his watch chain a small medallion bearing the same pelican emblem as that upon the manuscript of St. Cyprian. I was struck dumb for a moment. Then he is part of it. So it would seem. Yet the Reverend Merridew is no fool, nor is he a murderer by temperament. I would rather call him a devotee, a man who believes he serves a higher purpose, and therein lies our danger, Watson. The fanatic is always logical within his own universe. He rose abruptly, shrugged into his coat, and reached for his walking stick. "Come, it is time you met our reverend scholar yourself." St. Luke's Church in Holborn is one of those forgotten sanctuaries that London hides within her older districts, hemmed in by warehouses and counting-houses, its spire scarcely visible amid the forest of chimneys. Within, however, it breathed a solemn tranquillity that contrasted sharply with the bustle of the streets. The air was heavy with wax and damp stone, and through the stained glass the pallid daylight filtered like wine through water. A thin figure stood near the chancel, arranging papers upon a lectern. His black cassock hung loosely upon his frame, and the sparse hair at his temples gleamed silver in the half-light. As we approached, he turned, revealing a face of singular delicacy, refined, ascetic, yet with eyes that burned too brightly for peace. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he said with a slight bow. "Dr. Watson, I presume. Inspector Lestrade was kind enough to inform me of your interest in poor Harcourt's death." Holmes inclined his head. "A sad business, Reverend. You knew the deceased well. For nearly 20 years he was a man of letters and of conscience. His loss is deeply felt." Holmes's gaze rested for a moment upon the papers before the clergyman. "I see you are preparing a sermon. On what subject, if I may ask?" "The corruption of sacred knowledge," said Merridew quietly. "There are truths, Mr. Holmes, which men were not meant to unearth. To disturb them is to court judgment." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet you are a man of study, Reverend. You must have found yourself tempted on occasion to turn a forbidden page." A shadow crossed Merridew's face. "Tempted? Perhaps. But the path of inquiry is a narrow one, hemmed on either side by ruin. Harcourt did not believe that." "You spoke often with him about the manuscript of St. Cyprian." The clergyman hesitated. "You know of it?" "We have seen it." His eyes flashed, a mixture of alarm and fascination. "Then you have already seen too much." Holmes took a step nearer. "On the contrary, sir, I have seen too little. What is the nature of the work? Why should its mere existence drive a scholar to death?" Merridew's hands tightened upon the edge of the lectern. "Because it is not merely a book, Mr. Holmes. It is a map." "To what?" The Reverend's gaze wandered to the dim recesses of the nave, where the shadows clustered thickest. When he spoke again, his voice had sunk to a near whisper. "To the resting place of a relic older than the church itself, older than Christendom. The monks of St. Cyprian were its guardians. They sealed it beneath the earth with prayers of fire and blood. When the monastery fell, its secret passed into legend. Harcourt and I believed we could uncover it, that we might prove its existence. But he lost patience. He sought to unseal what was never meant to be unsealed." Holmes regarded him with a strange expression, neither pity nor judgment, but the cool scrutiny of a surgeon examining a tumor. "And did he succeed?" Merridew closed his eyes briefly. "He found the key." "The key of Mercury?" The clergyman's eyes snapped open, astonished. "You know the name?" "I make it my business to know names, Reverend. It is deeds that concern me." For a long moment Merridew was silent. Then, as though yielding to an irresistible compulsion, he opened a small drawer within the lectern and withdrew a brass disc suspended from a fine chain. Upon it was engraved the same pelican symbol we had seen before, but around its edge ran an inscription in minute letters. Holmes took the disc delicately between thumb and forefinger. "Lux et sanguis revelant." Light and blood reveal. The very phrase from the manuscript. "It is the symbol of the Brotherhood of St. Cyprian," said Merridew softly. "A society of scholars, or so we call ourselves, devoted to the preservation of certain ancient texts. Harcourt was one of us, but he believed the relic to be not sacred, but scientific. Some artifact of lost knowledge. He wanted to bring it to light. I begged him to desist. And when persuasion failed, I left him. That was 3 nights ago." The Reverend's voice trembled. "Now he is dead." Holmes turned the medallion once more in his fingers. "You speak of a relic, Reverend, and of a key. Tell me, does this medallion unlock anything more tangible than the conscience?" Merridew hesitated, then seemed to steel himself. "There is a mechanism beneath the crypt, an ancient seal of stone. It responds only to light reflected through the disc's center when certain words are spoken. It was a safeguard of the monks, a means to open the vault and close it again." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Ingenious. And you have performed this ritual yourself?" "Never," cried Merridew. "Nor would I. The legend warns that the vault guards not treasure but truth, and truth, Mr. Holmes, can be the most corrosive of all poisons." There was in his tone such fervor that I could not doubt his sincerity. Yet I saw Holmes's expression sharpen. That faint contraction of the lips which meant that some inner piece of his puzzle had found its place. "You are an honest man, Reverend," he said at last, "but honesty is a fragile shield. There are others, I think, who do not share your restraint." He replaced the disc upon the lectern, bowed slightly, and turned toward the door. "Come, Watson. I have learned what I required." Merridew's voice followed us. "If you value your life, Mr. Holmes, do not go beneath that library again." Holmes paused in the doorway and glanced back. "I have rarely found value in safety, Reverend. Good day." We rode back to Baker Street in silence. The cab rattled through the fog. The windows beaded with rain. At last I could contain myself no longer. "Holmes, do you believe him?" "Entirely," said he. "He spoke the truth, though not all of it. He believes the relic to be mystical. I suspect it is merely human. The danger lies not in the object, but in the minds of those who seek it." "And what do you propose?" He leaned forward, the faintest smile upon his lips. "We return to the library tonight." "Tonight?" "Indeed. Lestrade will provide his men for the upper floors. You and I shall descend below, by the hidden shaft behind the skirting board. If my calculations are correct, it leads directly to the crypt." "And the risk?" "Immeasurable," he said calmly, striking a match to light his pipe. "But so is the reward. For I believe we are about to unearth not merely a relic, Watson, but a deception buried beneath centuries of dust. A deception that has killed once already, and will not hesitate to kill again." That evening the fog rolled thick and yellow over the Strand, muffling the gas lamps and turning each window into a pale blur. We met Lestrade outside the library where 2 constables waited in silence. The building loomed above us, dark and forbidding, its columns like sentinels against the night. "Everything ready, Mr. Holmes?" asked the inspector. "As ready as our ignorance allows. Station your men at the main door and rear exit. No one enters or leaves. Watson and I will attend to the rest." Lestrade nodded grimly. "You'll have a signal if we hear anything." Holmes clasped his arm briefly. "Good man." We entered through the side door, our lanterns hooded. The silence was profound. The faint echo of our footsteps seemed sacrilegious. Holmes led the way to the northern wall, where the concealed aperture waited. With deft hands he removed the skirting board and revealed the narrow shaft behind. A gust of cold air breathed from its depths. "After you, Watson," said he. I stared at the blackness before us. "You mean to go down there, now?" "I mean to go down there before someone else does. Courage, my dear fellow, you shall have the honor of first descent." And so it was that with my revolver clenched and my heart hammering, I found myself squeezing through that dreadful passage, the stone scraping my shoulders and the air thick with the scent of earth long undisturbed. Holmes followed close behind, the faint glow of his lantern casting monstrous shadows before us. The shaft twisted sharply, then opened into a narrow corridor of ancient masonry. At its far end stood the iron door we had seen before, now ajar. Holmes raised his hand for silence. From within came the echo of footsteps, soft, deliberate, and drawing nearer. He leaned close and whispered, "Steady, Watson. The game begins." Chapter 5. The Vault of Whispering Stone. I have often reflected that of all the adventures which befell us during my long association with Sherlock Holmes, none ever impressed itself upon my nerves as did that night's descent into the crypt beneath the Aldwych Library. There was something so peculiarly oppressive in that airless dark, a mingling of scholarly dust and subterranean dread, that even now, when I look back upon it in the quiet of age, I feel again the chill breath of that underworld stealing up my spine. The passage through which we had crawled delivered us into a stone corridor so narrow that we were obliged to proceed single file. The damp walls glimmered faintly in the light of Holmes's lantern, their surfaces furred with lichen, and carved here and there with the worn outlines of what seemed to be letters. Latin, perhaps, though centuries of decay had rendered them indecipherable. The sound of our breathing echoed back upon us with unnatural clarity, so that it seemed as though invisible company crept beside us in the dark. At the corridor's end yawned the iron door we had found before, now open as if waiting. Holmes halted, his profile outlined against the lantern's dim glow, and listened. From beyond came a slow, rhythmic sound, a voice chanting, low and measured, rising and falling like the tolling of a hidden bell. "The same voice we heard last night," I whispered. Holmes nodded once. "And not alone, if I mistake not. Do you perceive the echo layered upon the first? 2, perhaps 3. We have stumbled upon a ceremony, Watson, one in which our late librarian may have been an unwilling celebrant." He raised the lantern and motioned me onward. Together we stepped through the doorway and into the crypt. It was a vast chamber of stone, its roof supported by squat pillars whose capitals were carved with grotesque faces, half man and half beast. Between them stretched rows of ancient coffers, some broken and empty, others sealed with the heavy wax of forgotten centuries. In the center stood a circular dais of black marble, encircled by symbols etched into the floor, the same concentric figures we had seen in the manuscriptus Cipriani. Upon the dais burned 3 candles, their flames guttering in the draught, and before them knelt a man in clerical garb, the light glinting upon the brass disc that hung from his neck. "The Reverend Merridew," I breathed. Holmes's hand fell upon my arm in caution. "Hush." Another figure moved in the gloom, tall, broad-shouldered, his features hidden by the shadow of a hood. He held in his hands a small chest of carved wood, no larger than a Bible. As we watched, he placed it upon the dais and stepped back, bowing his head. Merridew began to speak in that same sing-song rhythm, his voice trembling but clear. "Lux et songis revelant, quod latit sub terris, nunc pateat in nomini." The words echoed from the stone, gathering strength as though the very walls repeated them. Then Merridew lifted the medallion, and the candlelight struck it in such fashion that a narrow beam reflected downward into the heart of the black marble. Instantly there came a faint grinding noise, and a fissure appeared across the dais, widening with slow deliberation until the stone parted like the lid of a tomb. Holmes drew a sharp breath. "By all that's rational! A mechanical seal!" From within the opening rose a small platform of metal, bearing upon it a cylindrical object wrapped in decayed silk. The clergyman reached out trembling fingers, and at that moment Holmes stepped forward, the lantern's light falling full upon his face. "That will do, Reverend." The chant ceased as if cut by a knife. Merridew staggered back, the medallion falling from his grasp and clattering upon the stone. The hooded figure turned, and in that instant I saw the face of our true adversary. "Good Lord, it's Griggs, the porter." The man's expression twisted between fear and fury. "You've no right here," he snarled. "This is holy ground." Holmes regarded him with icy composure. "Holy? Hardly. You are desecrating both scripture and reason with this play-acting. Drop that chest." Instead, Griggs snatched the object from the dais and darted toward the far passage. I fired, more to startle than to kill, and the report thundered through the crypt like a cannon. The bullet struck the stone beside him, and fragments flew. He stumbled, recovered, and vanished into the dark. "After him, Watson!" cried Holmes. We gave chase through the twisting corridors, our lanterns swinging wildly and casting grotesque shadows upon the walls. The air grew colder, damper, until we burst into a narrow cul-de-sac that ended in a flight of ancient steps. Griggs was halfway up them when the brittle stone gave way beneath his feet. With a strangled cry he fell, the chest flying from his hands. Holmes reached him in an instant, but it was too late. The man lay motionless, his head bent at a dreadful angle. Holmes examined him briefly, then straightened. "Neck broken. Instantaneous." He turned to the chest, which had burst open in the fall. Within lay a roll of parchment bound by a crimson cord, and something else, a small glass vial containing a dark viscous fluid. Holmes lifted it with care. "Ink, Watson, or what passed for it in the 17th century. Look at the sediment. Ferric gall, yes, but mingled with human blood, if I am not mistaken. Our Reverend was literal in his interpretation of light and blood reveal." I shuddered. "Then the manuscript was written perhaps in the very substance this vial contains. A relic indeed, though of barbarous manufacture." He replaced it carefully and retied the cord around the parchment. "We shall examine both presently. But first let us see whether our surviving participant has regained his composure." We returned to the dais, where Merridew had sunk to his knees, his face buried in his hands. The candles had burned low, and their flickering light lent his features a ghastly pallor. When Holmes addressed him, he lifted his head with a sob. "It was never meant to be opened. I tried to stop him. I swear it." Holmes regarded him gravely. "And yet you performed the ritual." I thought if I enacted the rite as written, it would seal the vault again. But he forced me to continue. He said there was gold, secrets that would make him rich. I only wished to keep the curse contained." Holmes's expression softened slightly. "You have been a fool, Reverend, but not a criminal. The law will treat you as such. Come, we must leave this place." He extinguished the candles and replaced the stone lid upon the dais, which fell into place with a dull finality. Together we made our way back through the passage to the trapdoor, where Lestrade and his men awaited us, their lanterns blazing in the gloom. The inspector's eyes widened at the sight of the Reverend's bloodless face and the bundle in Holmes's hands. "Good heavens! What in blazes?" "A tragedy and a discovery," said Holmes shortly. "The porter Griggs is dead, the victim of his own avarice. This," he indicated the bundle, "was what he sought. Guard it carefully, Inspector, and see that no one enters the crypt again without my direction." Back at Baker Street, as the dawn crept grey over the housetops, Holmes laid the parchment upon the table and began his examination with that meticulous absorption which was to him both science and religion. I, for my part, was content to sit in silence, nursing a cup of coffee and watching the fog thin upon the window panes. At length he looked up. As I suspected, the writing is a cipher, a substitutional code based upon the planetary symbols. But see here. He pointed to a series of figures at the top of the page. Coordinates, though not geographic. Library shelf numbers, perhaps. Or the key to another text. And note the heading. De clavis lunaris. The key of the moon. What does it mean? Holmes leaned back, the faintest gleam of triumph in his eyes. It means, Watson, that the Brotherhood of St. Cyprian were less concerned with theology than with cryptography. Their so-called relic was no holy object, but a ciphered document, a work of scholarship disguised as heresy too, protected from the fires of the Reformation. Harcourt, poor fellow, must have realized as much and sought to publish it. The Brotherhood, or what remains of it, feared exposure, and silenced him. I stared. Then his death was not of fright, but of design. I found traces of vapor upon his whiskers that could only have arisen from the inhalation of ethereal fumes. The same scent pervaded the crypt. Frankincense, yes, but mingled with chloroform. Harcourt was rendered insensible. The fumes induced a fatal syncope, and the door was locked behind him to simulate natural death. And Merridew, an unwilling accomplice. Griggs, the porter, was the true hand, the Brotherhood's servant. When greed overcame superstition, he tried to seize the manuscript for himself. The irony, Watson, is exquisite. He rose, stretching his long limbs with a sigh. Lestrade will have his report by noon. The Brotherhood's existence will, I trust, remain a curiosity rather than a scandal. As for this, he gestured to the parchment, it shall be deposited with the British Museum, where superstition may give way to study. As the first rays of morning touched the cluttered walls of Baker Street, Holmes lit his pipe and regarded the smoke as it curled upward into the light. There are times, he said softly, when knowledge must sleep until the world is ready to receive it. Yet it is the task of men like ourselves to guard the door, neither wholly shut nor flung wide, but open just enough for reason to breathe. He smiled faintly, the weariness of the night passing from his face. Come, Watson, you look as though you have seen a ghost. Perhaps I have, I answered, or something worse, the ghost of reason itself, buried beneath the stones of faith. Holmes chuckled. Then let us exorcise it with breakfast. And with that most prosaic of prescriptions, he turned to ring for Mrs. Hudson, while I sat watching the fog retreat from Baker Street, thinking how thin is the veil that separates scholarship from madness, and how often it falls to my friend to mend it. Chapter 6. The Cipher of the Moon. The events of that extraordinary night had left me fatigued beyond expression, yet my companion appeared only invigorated by them. When I awoke late the next morning, I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, the remnants of his toast untouched, his entire attention absorbed by a folio of papers spread before him. His dressing gown hung loosely from his angular frame, and a thin haze of blue smoke coiled about his head like a wreath of thought. "Good morning, Watson," said he, without lifting his eyes. "You find me on the threshold of discovery. Coffee is at your elbow. You will need it." I took the cup gratefully and sank into the chair opposite him. The folio contained the De clavis lunaris parchment we had recovered from the crypt, now unrolled and weighted at the corners. Its surface shimmered faintly where Holmes had brushed away the dust of centuries. Upon it I saw lines of characters, each bearing a curious resemblance to the symbols of the planets. Crescents, circles, and crosses, mingled with small dots and strokes in patterns that seemed to repeat, and yet never resolve into sense. Holmes tapped the parchment with the stem of his pipe. "Here, Watson, is the true heart of our case. The Brotherhood thought they were protecting a relic. In fact, they were guarding a cipher. Observe the structure. These symbols fall into groups of 7, repeating every third line. That at once suggests a lunar cycle. 21 days. Hence, the key of the moon." "You mean," said I, that the text encodes something astronomical? Not precisely astronomical, nor chronological. The ancients were fond of aligning their codes to calendars. Each lunar phase represented a substitutional shift. But look further. Beneath the symbols lie faint indentations, barely perceptible. I discovered them by means of a chloride wash. These indentations correspond to the numerals we saw in Harcourt's ledger, 17, 4, 12. Positions, not numbers, my dear fellow. Positions within a larger scheme. He leaned back, his grey eyes gleaming. Last night's pursuit revealed only the outer crust of the mystery. I believe this parchment conceals not one secret, but two. The Brotherhood's own cipher, and a message hidden within it by one of their number. Perhaps even Harcourt himself. I could not forbear a smile. And you mean to unearth both before luncheon? Holmes's lips twitched. Before tea, if possible. For the better part of 2 hours he labored in silence, his pencil moving swiftly across sheets of foolscap. From time to time he muttered fragments. Mercury ascending, lunation shift, repeated glyph, which conveyed to me as little as the chirping of a telegraph. Meanwhile I applied myself to the newspaper, where the death of Edmund Harcourt already occupied a column under the title Tragic Demise of a Scholar. The article, though brief, hinted at rumors of mystical experiments and ancient rites, but wisely refrained from naming the Brotherhood of St. Cyprian. I suspected that Holmes's discreet intervention with Lestrade had ensured as much. At length he rose, crossed to the window, and stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, gazing into the drifting fog. Watson, said he suddenly, do you recall the geometric diagrams in the manuscriptus Cypriani? Perfectly. And the note. The seal beneath remains intact. None must descend without the key of Mercury. What is Mercury? In the language of alchemists, the messenger of the gods, and the symbol of mind. Exactly. Combine that with the lunar reference, and we have intellect guided by reflection. A poetic description, if you will, of translation by mirror. Do you follow? Dimly. He turned, his face alight with that peculiar fervor which came upon him when deduction quickened into revelation. This cipher is meant to be read by reflection. A mirror text, Watson. The lunar motif was not metaphor, but instruction. The moon reflects light, therefore the code reflects meaning. He placed a small hand mirror beside the parchment and adjusted it so that the symbols appeared reversed in the glass. At once the pattern transformed. Where before there had been meaningless circles and crescents, now emerged a series of Roman letters faintly discernible in the mirror's surface. By Jove! I exclaimed. They form words. Holmes nodded, scribbling furiously. Ad lumen ultimum, repeated throughout. Toward the last light. A motto, perhaps, or a direction. And here, Codex Selinis, custodiatur sub fundamentis bibliothecae secundae. He translated softly. Let the Codex of the Moon be guarded beneath the foundations of the second library. There, Watson, lies the second secret. The second library, I echoed. But what can that mean? Holmes smiled. It means, my dear fellow, that the Aldwych Library was not the only repository of St. Cyprian's order. There is, or was, another. By early afternoon we had verified through several antiquarian sources that an earlier Aldwych Library had indeed existed on another site, a smaller institution attached to a private collection in Clerkenwell, demolished during the construction of the Holborn Viaduct some 50 years before. Its surviving materials had been transferred to the current building, but no record spoke of its foundations or the fate of its subterranean chambers. Holmes's enthusiasm grew with each new scrap of evidence. Consider the elegance of it, Watson. The Brotherhood hid their most precious text beneath the ruins of their first sanctuary, then built the second library as a decoy. Harcourt discovered the ruse, and Griggs murdered him to keep the secret buried. Yet even in death, the old scholar contrived to leave us the coordinates, 17-4-12, the press marks that led us to the manuscriptus Cypriani, and thence to this clue. He paced the room in long, restless strides. We must find the site of the original library. "That may not be easy," said I. "The ground there has been entirely rebuilt." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Then we shall begin with the archives of the city surveyor's office. There are always plans, and if we are fortunate, a mention of a vault." By late afternoon we found ourselves standing in a draughty chamber of the Guildhall, surrounded by yellowed rolls of vellum and the dust of centuries. A grey-haired clerk assisted us in unrolling a massive map bearing the date 1839. Upon it, amid a maze of streets and properties, was marked the Old Aldwych Library, private. Beneath it, in faint pencil, someone had added, "Subterranean chapel discovered during excavation, sealed 1841. Holmes's long finger traced the entry with satisfaction. "Subterranean chapel. Our second crypt, and its position, you note, lies directly beneath the present offices of a publishing firm. Curious symmetry, is it not? The keepers of words inheriting the guardianship of secrets." He thanked the clerk, pocketed a small note of the location, and we took our leave. As our cab rattled eastward through the deepening dusk, Holmes sat silent, his eyes fixed upon the fog-dimmed windows. At last he spoke. "This second vault, Watson, is the true heart of the mystery. The Brotherhood's rites, the Reverend's medallion, even the tragedy of poor Harcourt, all were but the shadow cast by what lies there. If I am not mistaken, the Codex Silenis is an early treatise on cryptologic science, perhaps the earliest known, concealed under the veil of alchemy and religion to preserve it from destruction. And you think it still exists?" "I think it waits," said Holmes. "And perhaps we are not the only ones who seek it." We arrived at the publishing house just as the clerks were leaving. Holmes engaged the foreman in brief conversation, producing a letter from the city surveyor authorizing our inspection of the lower vaults. The man, accustomed no doubt to eccentric scholars, led us down a narrow stair to the basement, where stacks of unsold volumes stood in dusty pyramids. The air smelled of ink and damp paper. "Here's the oldest part of the foundations," said he, pointing to a bricked arch at the far end. "Goes back before our time, sir. Sealed, as you see." The arch had indeed been closed with rough masonry, though the mortar was of newer color than the surrounding stone. Holmes examined it closely, his lens glinting in the lantern light. "Fresh work. Within a year at most. Our Brotherhood has been active here, Watson." He turned to the foreman. "You may leave us for a quarter of an hour. We shall disturb nothing." The man withdrew, and Holmes at once produced a small hammer and chisel from his pocket. With delicate precision he struck away a section of the mortar, until a loose brick yielded. A faint current of air issued forth, chill and dry. "Help me, Watson." Together we cleared enough of the opening to crawl through. Beyond lay a narrow stair descending into utter blackness. The lantern's beam caught the gleam of stone steps worn smooth by long use. Holmes held up the light and looked back at me. "The second crypt," he murmured. "Take care. These steps may be treacherous." We descended slowly. At the bottom we found ourselves in a chamber smaller than the first, but better preserved. The air was dry, almost sterile, and the walls bore remnants of frescoes in faded pigment, figures of monks holding scrolls, their faces erased by time. At the center stood a single pedestal of white marble, upon which rested a coffer bound in bronze and sealed with red wax now blackened by age. Across its lid were carved the same words that had haunted the cipher, "Ad lumen ultimum." Holmes approached reverently, his face alight with wonder. "This is it, Watson, the Codex Silenis." He examined the seal without touching it. "Unbroken for 2 centuries. We shall not violate it here. The law of property must have its due." At that moment a faint scrape sounded behind us. We turned sharply. The beam of Holmes's lantern caught a movement near the stair, the brief flash of a face, pale as marble, and the glint of steel in a raised hand. Holmes sprang aside, the dagger's thrust missing him by a hair's breadth. The lantern fell, plunging us into half-darkness. I caught the intruder's arm and grappled with him. We stumbled against the pedestal, and the coffer rocked dangerously. The man fought with desperate strength, muttering words I could not comprehend. Latin, perhaps, or madness. Holmes struck the weapon from his hand, and it clattered across the stones. When we at last subdued him and brought the lantern upright again, its light revealed a face both familiar and dreadful in its transformation. "The Reverend Merridew!" I gasped. He lay panting at our feet, his eyes wild and fevered. "You do not understand," he whispered. "It must not be taken. The codex must remain in darkness until the last light falls." Holmes regarded him gravely. "You have risked your life, Reverend, and ours, for a superstition. Yet perhaps even superstition serves its purpose. The dead cannot keep secrets. The living must." Merridew covered his face with his hands. "Forgive me. I was not myself. It was as though the place called to me." Holmes touched my arm. "We shall leave him here no longer. Come, we must deliver him to Lestrade before his penitence fades." He turned once more to the marble pedestal and bowed his head slightly, as one might before a venerable scholar rather than a tomb. "Knowledge sleeps," he murmured, "but not forever." Then, taking up the lantern, he led the way back toward the stair, the echo of our footsteps mingling with the whispered Latin that still seemed to breathe from the stones. Chapter 7. The Shadow of the Brotherhood. When next I resumed my chronicle of those events, so strangely poised between the rational and the mystical, I found my pen reluctant to keep pace with the memory of that dreadful night. For even as Holmes and I emerged from the subterranean passage beneath Clerkenwell and delivered the trembling Reverend Merridew into Lestrade's custody, I could not banish from my mind the echo of those whispered words. "Until the last light falls." They clung to the corners of my thought like a cobweb one cannot brush away. The morning that followed was a grey, listless one. London wore that expression of dreary endurance which I have only ever seen upon her face after nights of heavy fog and fevered mystery. Yet in our rooms at Baker Street there was no hint of lassitude. Holmes, who had slept scarcely an hour, seemed more alive than ever, his eyes alight with the cold fire of pursuit. He had just concluded a conference with Lestrade, and when I entered the sitting-room, I found him standing before the hearth, his fingers pressed together in that attitude which always heralded a profound conclusion. "Watson," said he, "our case is by no means concluded. Indeed, it has only now begun to reveal its true dimensions." I poured myself a cup of the strong black coffee Mrs. Hudson had left upon the tray. "You refer, I suppose, to the Brotherhood of St. Cyprian?" "Precisely. You and I have seen but two of its members, Merridew, the unfortunate visionary, and Griggs, the avaricious servant. But such institutions are hydra-headed. When one falls, another rises. The Brotherhood still breathes in London, Watson, and it has already scented our interference." I started. "You have evidence of this?" He handed me a sheet of thick vellum folded twice and sealed with red wax. The seal bore the unmistakable emblem of the pelican and her brood. "This arrived by hand not half an hour ago," said Holmes, "delivered by a messenger who vanished before Mrs. Hudson could question him." I broke the seal and read aloud the brief, chilling message. "To Mr. Sherlock Holmes of Baker Street. You meddle in matters whose depth is beyond even your science. Return what was taken and trouble us no more, or the light you prize will be extinguished. A servant of the second circle." Holmes smiled faintly. "A literary turn of phrase, but the threat beneath it is quite genuine. Then we are dealing with men of learning, or at least men who fancy themselves such. Just so. Scholars, clergymen, antiquaries, the kind of minds that warp under the weight of forbidden knowledge. They are the most dangerous of adversaries, for they murder not for gain, but for creed." I glanced at the folded parchment lying upon the table, the De Clavis Lunaris. "And they mean to recover this?" Holmes nodded. "Which is why I have already taken the precaution of removing it from Baker Street. Lestrade will deliver it to the British Museum under sealed custody this afternoon. Yet I doubt that will deter them. Once a man has tasted the draught of obsession, no lock can hold him." It was not until that evening that the first sign of the Brotherhood's renewed activity revealed itself. I had gone out to make a late call upon a patient, leaving Holmes alone at Baker Street. Upon my return, I found the street unusually dark. The lamps nearest our lodgings had been extinguished, and a strange hush lay over the neighborhood. When I entered the sitting room, my friend was standing by the window, a revolver in his hand. "You are armed," I exclaimed. "An elementary precaution," he said coolly. "We have been watched." He pointed toward the street below. In the foggy half-light, I saw the vague outline of a man standing motionless beside a lamp-post. His face was obscured by the brim of a hat, but even at that distance there was something unnaturally still in his posture. "Since dusk," said Holmes, "he has not moved so much as a finger. I took the liberty of testing his patience by playing the violin for an hour. It remains undisturbed. Surely we might summon a constable." "My dear Watson," said Holmes, "the moment we move against him we learn nothing. The true value of a spy lies not in his presence, but in what he reports. Let us permit him to believe that he has succeeded." He set the revolver upon the mantelpiece and poured himself a measure of brandy. "I have, however, taken steps to identify him. A small note dispatched by Page to my informant in the yard should suffice." "Then you suspect he belongs to the Brotherhood?" "I suspect," said Holmes, "that he belongs to the world, and the world, as you know, is large enough to include fanatics." He turned abruptly toward me. "Watson, are you familiar with Professor Edwin Mallory, the Orientalist? A Fellow of the Royal Society?" "The same. A man of erudition, but also of peculiar interests. He has written several papers upon the Hermetic sciences, and once translated a fragment of the Emerald Tablet, which earned him censure from his peers. More to the point, he served as benefactor to the Old Witch Library for several years, and was Harcourt's personal patron." "Then you believe—" "I believe that the good professor's curiosity has not waned. The note we received bears a hand remarkably similar to his published correspondence. The servant of the Second Circle is none other than Professor Mallory himself." The following day we set out for Mallory's residence in Bloomsbury. It was a tall, narrow house overlooking a square choked with plane trees, their branches bare against the pale sky. A servant ushered us into a study that was less a room than a museum of strange objects. Skulls, maps, astrolabes, and manuscripts crowded every surface. A single shaft of winter light fell upon the figure at the desk, a man of perhaps 50, his head bald save for a fringe of silver, his eyes piercing and colorless. "Mr. Holmes," he said, rising. "Dr. Watson, I presume. I have expected you." Holmes bowed. "Then we are spared the necessity of introduction." Mallory's thin lips curved into a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You have interfered in matters of scholarship, Mr. Holmes. Matters which do not concern a detective." "I interfere only in matters which concern truth," said Holmes. "And truth, Professor, is the common property of all men." The scholar's expression hardened. "You have in your possession a document, a relic of our order. It rests safely in the custody of the law." "The law!" Mallory's voice quivered with scorn. "Do you imagine the British Museum can comprehend what it holds? The Codex Silenis is no common relic. It contains principles that would overturn the very foundations of human knowledge." Holmes's gaze was steady. "Then perhaps it is fortunate that mankind remains upon its present foundation. You speak of knowledge, yet you kill to conceal it." The professor's hand trembled. "Harcourt's death was an accident." "Indeed. The chloroform vapor, the locked door, the forged entry in the ledger, all accidents, no doubt." Mallory's eyes blazed. "You understand nothing. Harcourt would have exposed centuries of work, the lineage of those who preserved the Codex through fire and war. He would have dragged the Brotherhood into ridicule and ruin. I sought only to restrain him." Holmes stepped closer, his voice low and cold. "And so you murdered him." The professor recoiled, his composure momentarily shattered. Then with an effort he recovered himself. "You cannot prove it." "I shall endeavor to do so," said Holmes, "before the day is out." Mallory's smile returned, thinner and more terrible than before. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes. There are forces at work which even you cannot master. You are meddling in a game played long before you were born." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Then I shall take comfort in my ignorance. Good day, Professor." When we had regained the street, Holmes's expression was grim. Mallory is the head of the Brotherhood. Of that I have no doubt. He believes himself the custodian of forbidden knowledge. His vanity will be his undoing. And what of Merridew? Still under guard at Scotland Yard. I intend to confront him with Mallory's confession before the day is done. The two are bound together by ties of fear as much as faith. We had not gone 20 yards when a hansom cab drew up sharply beside us. The driver leaned down, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. "Message for Mr. Holmes," he said, handing down an envelope. Holmes took it, opened it, and uttered a short exclamation. Inside was a single sheet bearing only a few words, scrawled in haste. "The light falls tonight." He crushed the paper in his fist. "Watson, to the British Museum, quickly. The Codex is in danger." We arrived at the museum as dusk descended. The great facade loomed against the darkening sky, its columns black silhouettes against the lamps. Inside, the corridors were almost deserted, save for a single constable who recognized Holmes at once. "The parchment, Mr. Holmes. It's gone," he cried. "The curator found the case broken not 10 minutes ago." Holmes darted forward. The display cabinet at the far end of the gallery stood open, its glass shattered, the label reading parchment of unknown provenance, dangling forlornly from its frame. He knelt, examining the shards upon the floor. Powdered glass, along the edges, dissolved with acid before being struck. A chemist's touch, Watson. Mallory again. "But the man is under observation." "Then he has friends," said Holmes grimly. "The Brotherhood's shadow extends farther than we thought." He rose, his eyes narrowing. "The note said tonight. They mean to complete the work their ancestors began. To bring the Codex to light, whatever that entails. And I believe I know where." "You mean—" "The first crypt," he said. "The one beneath the library. That is where the ceremony will occur. Come, Watson. There is no time to lose." The hansom rattled through the fog like a bullet through smoke. London lay silent, her gas lamps blurred halos in the gloom. Holmes sat rigid, his features carved from stone, every line of his face set in grim resolve. At last he spoke. "When men of intellect turn to fanaticism, Watson, the world grows perilous indeed. Tonight we shall see how far reason can withstand the dark." He checked his revolver, then met my eye with that rare look which told me that beneath his icy exterior there beat a heart not immune to human peril. "Whatever awaits us below," he said quietly. "You understand the risk?" I nodded. "I have faced worse in your company." Holmes's mouth twitched in something that was almost a smile. "You flatter me, my dear fellow." As the cab drew up before the shadowed facade of the Aldwych Library, the clock of St. Clement Danes struck 9. The great doors loomed before us like the gate of some forgotten temple. Holmes stepped down, his revolver gleaming faintly in the lamplight. "Come, Watson," he murmured. "The Brotherhood keeps its vigil, and the game, I think, is about to reach its climax." End of Chapter 7. The Shadow of the Brotherhood. Approx. 1,720 words. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8, The Night of the Second Circle, in which Holmes and Watson infiltrate the library once more and witness the Brotherhood's terrible ritual as the Codex Selenius is brought to light? Chapter 8. The Night of the Second Circle. The night that followed will forever remain etched upon my memory as one of the strangest and most perilous episodes of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. For it was on that bitter January evening beneath the fog-swathed towers of London that I saw the final rites of the Brotherhood of St. Cyprian enacted in the crypt beneath the Aldwych Library. A spectacle of intellect debased to madness, of science masquerading as sorcery. The return to the library. The hansom drew up before the great doors of the Aldwych Library, whose shadowed facade loomed like a sepulchre against the lamplight. The fog lay thick and sulphurous, swallowing the sound of the horses' hooves so that our arrival seemed almost spectral. Holmes alighted first, his revolver glinting faintly beneath his coat. "Quickly, Watson," he murmured. "They are already below. Note the light in the upper windows. The porter's room. It should be dark at this hour. Someone keeps watch above while the right unfolds beneath." We slipped through the side entrance with the keys Lestrade had entrusted to us, locking the door silently behind. The vast reading room lay in utter darkness save for the faint orange glow filtering up through the floorboards, light that seemed to pulse, as if the stones themselves breathed. Holmes knelt and pressed his palm to the carpet. "Feel that, Watson. The warmth. Candle flame by the 100. And the murmur of many voices below." He straightened, his expression grave. "They have convened in full council. The Brotherhood meets. And for the last time, if I can help it." Send. Descent. We moved swiftly to the northern wall, where the skirting board concealed the secret passage. Holmes removed it with deft precision, revealing the narrow aperture beyond. The air that issued from it was heavy with incense and the faint sickly sweetness of burning wax. "You first, my dear fellow," said Holmes softly. "I shall be directly behind you. We must tread with the silence of shadows." I entered the passage, my hand upon the revolver in my pocket, and descended the cramped stair. The flicker of light grew stronger with each step until we emerged once more into the crypt. Though transformed beyond recognition, where before had been darkness and decay, there now glowed 100 candles set upon the ancient sarcophagi. At the center, upon the black marble dais, stood the Codex Selenius, its bronze bindings gleaming like molten gold. Around it were gathered perhaps a dozen figures, all robed and hooded, their faces obscured. At their head stood Professor Edwin Mallory, the voice of the scholar, rich, sonorous, and utterly possessed, echoed from the vaulted roof. "Brothers of the second circle, the hour foretold has come. The moon wanes, the light declines, and knowledge must be reborn through the fire of the mind." A murmur of assent ran through the assembly. Mallory raised the codex high above his head. "For centuries we have guarded this wisdom from the profane, but tonight, under the sign of Mercury and the moon, we shall unseal it and become as those who first saw light." Holmes's whisper brushed my ear. "Fanaticism, Watson. The fever of intellect unmoored from conscience." "Shall we intervene?" I breathed. "Not yet. Let them reveal their purpose." 3. The ritual Mallory placed the codex upon the dais and drew from his breast a small vial, the twin, no doubt, of that which we had recovered from Griggs's body. He poured its dark contents into a silver basin and lit it with a taper. A pale flame sprang up, sending coils of violet smoke into the air. The assembled men began to chant, a rhythmic monotone that echoed through the crypt like the beating of a heart. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Observe, Watson. They use chemical light to expose hidden writing. A primitive photoreactive ink, perhaps drawn from phosphoric salts. The fumes are deadly. That explains Harcourt's collapse." Indeed, as the smoke thickened, several of the hooded figures swayed unsteadily. Mallory, undeterred, opened the codex and held it above the flame. Strange symbols shimmered upon the page, not letters but shapes of light, shifting and coalescing. He cried out in triumph, "Lux et sangi revelant, behold, the final illumination." Holmes moved then with the suddenness of a striking hawk. He leapt from the shadows, seized the codex from the dais and flung it to the ground, where the burning liquid hissed and guttered. The chanting ceased in a chaos of shouts. "In the name of the law," Holmes cried, "this assembly is at an end." Mallory turned, his eyes blazing. "You fool! You have doomed us all!" He snatched a revolver from beneath his robe, but before he could fire, I sprang forward and struck his arm aside. The shot rang out, shattering a candle and plunging half the chamber into darkness. The mob surged. Robes brushed past me, hands clawed at my coat. Holmes's voice rang out above the tumult. "Watson, the door! Block the passage!" I obeyed instinctively, overturning one of the heavy sarcophagi to bar the nearest exit. The crash echoed like thunder. Several of the Brotherhood fled toward the far corridor, their chants dissolving into screams as the smoke choked the air. Holmes grappled with Mallory near the dais. I saw the glint of steel, a dagger, then a sharp cry. I fired blindly, and the weapon clattered to the stones. When the smoke cleared, Mallory was upon his knees, the madness drained from his face. "It was not meant to kill," he gasped. "Only to reveal. To reveal." Holmes caught him as he swayed and laid him gently against the wall. "The only revelation here, Professor, is of human folly." Afaleb. Collapse. The fumes grew thicker, acrid and suffocating. Flames licked up the draped banners of the dais. Holmes seized my arm. "The vault will not stand the fire. We must get out." Together we dragged Mallory toward the stair, the heat searing our faces. Behind us the marble cracked with a hideous sound. The dais split down its center, and a burst of flame shot upward, followed by a deep, booming roar. Dust rained from the ceiling. The Brotherhood's sacred crypt was collapsing. We gained the passage just as the vault gave way. The stair trembled beneath our feet, and a torrent of smoke pursued us upward like a living thing. We burst into the library, coughing and blackened, as Lestrade and his men came running down the corridor. "Holmes! Good heavens! What the devil's happening?" "The Brotherhood," Holmes managed, "has concluded its final meeting." The aftermath. By dawn the fire was extinguished. The crypt beneath the library had caved in completely, sealing forever the remnants of the Brotherhood's sanctuary. Of its members, only Mallory and 2 others survived to face justice. The rest were entombed by the very stones they had sought to command. Lestrade, pale and shaken, stood beside us amid the ruin. "Never saw the like of it, Mr. Holmes. Scholars, men of letters, it's beyond comprehension." "Not beyond it, Inspector," said Holmes quietly. "Only beyond wisdom." Mallory, under guard, was carried out upon a stretcher. As he passed us, he opened his eyes and murmured faintly, "The light still falls." Holmes watched him go, his expression unreadable. "Poor devil," he said at last. "He sought illumination and found only fire." 6. Reflection at Baker Street. That evening, back at Baker Street, Holmes sat in his armchair with the remains of the Codex Silenus before him, the parchment scorched but intact. He had succeeded in rescuing it from the blaze at great personal risk. "It will be placed under lock at the museum," he said, "where scholars may study it for what it truly is, a treatise upon the reflection of light, the earliest known exploration of optical ciphers, a noble pursuit perverted by the vanity of men who mistook secrecy for sanctity." He drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. "Knowledge, Watson, is like the moon. It shines only by reflected light. When men forget that the source is the sun of reason, they wander in darkness and call it revelation." I looked out upon the fog-wreathed street, where the lamps burned dimly in the winter mist. "And the Brotherhood?" I asked. "Extinct," said Holmes. "But its shadow remains. There will always be those who prefer mystery to truth. It is our task to keep the balance, to let in just enough light to dispel the night, but not so much as to blind the eyes." He smiled, that rare, wistful smile which belonged to no case but to the man himself. "Now, my dear fellow, if you would be so good as to ring for Mrs. Hudson. I fancy even the vanquishers of secret societies must dine." Chapter 9. The Silent Aftermath. The events of that terrible night beneath the Aldwych Library left upon my mind an impression more haunting than any battle I had witnessed in Afghanistan. The smoke, the fire, the echo of chanting voices swallowed by the collapse of stone, all returned to me in uneasy dreams for many nights thereafter. But Holmes, as ever, emerged from the ordeal as cool and self-possessed as though he had merely solved a chess problem. To him the ruin of the Brotherhood of St. Cyprian was but one more move upon the vast board of human folly. A City That Forgot. A week passed. London, with her unfailing talent for oblivion, had already turned to fresher scandals. The press spoke briefly of a catastrophe in the Aldwych Library, an unfortunate fire, the loss of several rare volumes, and the narrow escape of two distinguished gentlemen. Not a word appeared of secret societies, ancient ciphers, or men consumed by their own enlightenment. Lestrade had kept his promise of discretion, and Holmes had vanished for 3 days into what he called post-mortem analysis. When at last he returned to Baker Street, he carried beneath his arm a packet of papers wrapped in brown cloth. He laid it upon the table and regarded it with the satisfaction of a naturalist setting down a newly discovered specimen. "The Codex Selenis," he said, "or what remains of it. The museum experts have restored enough of the surface to confirm my theory. It is no scripture, Watson, but a manual, a primitive treatise upon the refraction of light and its use in cryptographic projection. A most ingenious work, far in advance of its time. Then all their ritual, their chanting and incense. Stage scenery," said Holmes. "A pantomime to guard the serious study beneath. The monks of St. Cyprian, lacking the language of science, wrapped their discovery in the veils of mysticism. Their successors mistook the veil for the thing itself." He opened the folio, revealing faint diagrams, concentric lenses, angular rays, the delicate geometry of reflection. "Do you see, Watson? These men had stumbled upon the principle of photic encryption, the very foundation of modern optical ciphers. What they worshipped as divine illumination was, in truth, the bending of light through glass." He laughed softly, though not without pity. "Humanity ever mistakes its lamps for stars." Sen, the unfinished circle. Later that evening, as the rain tapped gently upon the windows, Mrs. Hudson brought in a telegram. Holmes tore it open and frowned. "From Lestrade," he said. "Merridew has escaped." "Escaped!" I cried. "From the infirmary? During the night? The guard found the window unlatched and the rope of torn bedding dangling outside. He cannot have gone far. The man is weak from his injuries. But the symbolism of the act interests me more than the act itself." "You think he was assisted?" "Undoubtedly. The brotherhood, though broken, is not extinct. One head lopped off does not kill a serpent whose body lies coiled beneath centuries. There are still sympathizers among scholars, antiquarians, perhaps even within the museum itself." He turned to the fire, his face illuminated by its glow. "They call themselves the Second Circle. Mallory was their visible center, but others, quieter, cleverer, survive him. They will not forgive our interference." I shuddered. "Then we may yet see this business revived?" Holmes nodded. "Revived, or perfected. Fanaticism, like light, refracts rather than ends." 3. Letters in the Ashes. 2 days later the mystery deepened. At breakfast Holmes received an envelope bearing no postmark, merely the impression of a signet seal, the pelican and her young. Inside lay a single sheet of heavy paper, its surface smudged with what appeared to be ash. Upon it, in a firm hand, were written the words, "The circle is broken, but not extinguished. The light you sought to hide has found new reflection. Seek not the mirror." Holmes read it twice, then held it to the flame of the lamp. The paper blackened and curled. "An empty threat," said I. "Not empty," he murmured. "A warning couched in their peculiar symbolism. Seek not the mirror. A reference, perhaps, to the reflective cipher itself, or to something more literal." He crossed to his desk and withdrew a photograph recently sent from the museum, the scorched remains of a bronze disc, Mallory's medallion. "Note the fracture line," he said. "It is not natural corrosion. Someone attempted to melt it, to destroy the focusing lens at its center. A crude but deliberate act. Then there was a second disc. Almost certainly, the Codex Selenis was designed for twin operation. 2 mirrors, 2 bearers. When one is aligned with the other, the true cipher reveals itself." I stared. "And the second?" He gave a thin smile. "Stolen, perhaps, by our fugitive priest." Afoot, the museum. Intrigue that afternoon brought another visitor, a small scholarly man with pince-nez and an air of nervous haste. He introduced himself as Mr. Vernon Blake, assistant curator of manuscripts at the British Museum. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I come at the request of the trustees. We have made a disturbing discovery connected with the manuscript you rescued." "Indeed?" Blake drew from his pocket a folded sheet. "While cleaning the binding, we found this fragment of vellum hidden between the covers. The writing is in Harcourt's hand." Holmes took the fragment carefully. Upon it were the words, "The true mirror lies not beneath the earth, but above it, where thought itself is reflected. Beware the scholar who kneels." Holmes's eyes brightened. "Admirable. Harcourt left us a posthumous clue. Where thought itself is reflected. A library's reading-room dome, perhaps, or a metaphor for intellect. And beware the scholar who kneels. A warning against reverence disguised as research." He folded the fragment and placed it in his pocket. "Mr. Blake, you have done well. Continue your work and inform me at once of any further discoveries." The curator bowed and departed, visibly relieved. V. Holmes. Alone. For several days thereafter, Holmes worked in seclusion, emerging only to snatch a cup of tea or a few bars upon the violin. I knew better than to interrupt him when he entered this condition. His thoughts, like a hound upon scent, required silence. It was near midnight when he at last summoned me. The fire had burned low, and upon the table lay a set of photographs, a mirror and a small lens apparatus. "Watson," said he, "I have reconstructed the Brotherhood's optical cipher. Observe." He set the bronze medallion fragment before the mirror, and adjusted the lens so that the lamplight passed through its center. Upon the opposite wall appeared a faint projection. "It's a circle within a circle, crossed by lines of Latin text. Ad lumen ultimum," I murmured. "Exactly. But see what happens when we rotate the lens to the proper angle." The inner circle dissolved, revealing a second inscription, one that had been invisible before. "Sub lus lunae, alter codex vigilat." Under the light of the moon, another codex keeps watch. Holmes straightened, the gleam of triumph in his eyes. "There is another manuscript, Watson, a companion to the first. Harcourt must have suspected its existence. The Brotherhood sought not to conceal, but to complete the pair. The first contained the method, the second, the meaning. And you know where to find it?" "I have a hypothesis," said he. "Tomorrow, when the moon is full, we shall test it." 6. The Moonlight Revelation. The following night was clear and cold, the fog blown eastward by a sharp wind. Holmes led me once more to the ruins of the old Aldwych Library, now fenced and deserted. The marble facade gleamed ghost-pale beneath the moon. "Do you recall, Watson," said he, "how the library's architecture mirrors itself, a dome above and a crypt below? Where thought itself is reflected. The upper dome is our mirror." He climbed the scaffolding with surprising agility, I close behind. From a gap in the collapsed roof, the moonlight poured through like a silver column. Holmes positioned the broken medallion within the beam. The light refracted, casting upon the inner curve of the dome a pattern of symbols identical to those of the Codex Salinis. "There," he whispered, "Harcourt's secret made manifest. Beneath this projection lies the vault of the second codex. The geometry is perfect." We descended to the corresponding point below, where the debris of the collapse still smoldered faintly. With Lestrade's men assisting at dawn, a small coffer was recovered from the rubble, unmarked, untouched by flame. Within lay a sheaf of vellum sheets, each written in Harcourt's precise hand. Holmes turned one page, his voice low and awed. "The Codex Lunaris Secundus, Harcourt's own translation, completed in secret. It was never mysticism, Watson. It was light, mathematics, and reason. And it cost him his life." 7th. Epilogue. That evening, as we sat once more before the fire, Holmes regarded the rescued manuscript thoughtfully. "There is a certain irony in it, Watson. Men perished guarding a truth that required only daylight to be harmless. The greatest danger lies not in what is hidden, but in the shadows men build around it." He smiled faintly. "The Brotherhood will fade, The Codex will rest among the curiosities of science, and London will continue to sleep beneath her fog. Yet somewhere, I suspect, a solitary scholar still kneels before his books, mistaking reflection for revelation. He rose, crossed to the window, and drew aside the curtain. The moon, serene and pale, hung above the rooftops like a watchful eye. "Look well, Watson," he said softly. "There is the true mirror of man's mind, bright enough to illuminate, dim enough to deceive." Chapter 8. The Scholar Who Knelt. There are few moments in a man's life when he perceives, however fleetingly, that he stands at the narrow border between knowledge and madness. The weeks that followed the discovery of the Codex Lunaris Secundus were of that order. The fire beneath the Aldwych library had consumed the greater part of the Brotherhood's sanctuary. Yet Holmes, restless as ever when a riddle still flickered in the ashes, refused to declare the affair concluded. "It is not the text that troubles me," he said one evening as we sat in our familiar armchairs. "It is the mind that worshipped it. We have exhumed the corpse of a philosophy, Watson, but not the soul that animated it. That soul still walks abroad. I, the visitor from the museum." The knock came not long after he had spoken, a timid, uncertain rapping that seemed to falter halfway through its resolve. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall, angular man of scholarly aspect, whose black coat shone threadbare at the elbows. His hands trembled as he clutched a hat that had long outlived its fashion. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes? I am George Ellicott, assistant curator at the British Museum. I fear I may have brought you trouble." Holmes waved him toward a chair. "Then you have done your duty, Mr. Ellicott. Tell me everything." The man swallowed. "Since the Codex was placed in our vaults, certain irregularities have occurred. Twice drawers have been found disturbed. On the second occasion, a message was left upon my desk. Here." He produced a slip of paper covered in spidery handwriting. "Light is not to be caged. The second circle endures. A friend of the flame." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "When did you receive this?" "Yesterday morning." "You have told no one else?" "No, sir. I feared ridicule, and, if I may confess it, I feared the writer." Holmes regarded him for a moment in silence. "You were wise to come. The flame, as you call it, has not gone out. It merely seeks another wick." He tapped the note thoughtfully against his palm. "The hand is familiar. Observe the elongated loop of the L and the tremor in the F. Our friend Meridew writes once more. Second, the trail of the penitent. Within the hour we were in pursuit. Lestrade, though weary of the Brotherhood and its enigmas, furnished 2 plainclothes constables at Holmes's request. Their instructions were simple. Watch the rear entrances of the museum and the libraries near Holborn. Holmes, meanwhile, traced the more subtle path. The purchases of wax, incense, and paper made under Meridew's name in various bookshops. By nightfall his net had drawn tight. "Our Reverend," said he, "has taken lodgings at number 4, Little Ormond Yard. A garret under the roof. We shall pay him a pastoral visit." It was a miserable quarter, half lost between bookbinders and printmakers, where the gutters gleamed with ink, and the smell of glue hung heavy. The stair that led to the garret was narrow and steep. At its summit a faint glow issued from a half-open door. Holmes motioned for silence and pushed it wide. The scene within might have been a monastic cell or a madman's chapel. Candles guttered on every surface, their smoke curling about stacks of open books. Upon the table lay the 2 halves of Mallory's broken medallion, painstakingly soldered together. Before it knelt Meridew himself, gaunt as a shadow, his lips moving in silent prayer. Holmes stepped forward. "Rise, Reverend. Your congregation awaits the light of reason." Meridew turned slowly. His eyes, once mild and sorrowful, now burned with an inner fever. "You have followed me," he said. "Why will you not leave the dead to their silence?" "Because you make the silence speak," replied Holmes. "You have written to the museum. You seek to awaken the circle anew." The clergyman's thin hands spread in appeal. "It cannot die, Mr. Holmes. The knowledge is too bright. Mallory erred through pride, I through fear. But together we glimpsed the truth. The codex is incomplete without the word, the sound that unlocks the light. Holmes's voice was gentle but inexorable. A delusion, Reverend. Your word is but the equation of refraction. Nothing more. Merridew shook his head slowly. You are wrong. When the light passes through the mirror, it speaks. I have heard it. His gaze turned upward, and I saw in that moment the full ruin of a mind once noble. He reached for the medallion, held it toward the flame of a candle, and whispered a fragment of Latin that I barely caught. Holmes sprang forward, but too late. The heat cracked the lens with a sharp report, and a blinding flash filled the room. The candle toppled, wax and flame scattered across the floor. We smothered it in an instant, yet when the smoke cleared, Merridew was upon his knees, clutching the broken disc to his breast. The light, he murmured. It lives in me now. Holmes stooped beside him, laid a hand upon his shoulder, and spoke with quiet compassion. Come, Reverend. The light you saw was only fire, and fire consumes. Third, the confession Merridew was taken under care to the infirmary at St. Thomas's, where the doctors declared his mind unhinged. Before his collapse, however, Holmes obtained a coherent statement from him, a confession that shed the last illumination upon the Brotherhood's history. The Brotherhood, it appeared, had not been founded by monks at all, but by a small circle of savants during the Restoration, men who hid their discoveries in alchemical disguise to escape persecution. Over generations, their descendants had transformed science into sacrament. Harcourt, the last true scholar among them, had uncovered the truth and sought to expose it. Mallory silenced him. Merridew repented too late. The circle's ritual had been the misremembered echo of an experiment in optics. Holmes listened to this narrative without triumph, only a weary satisfaction. It is ever the same, he said as we left the hospital. Man builds a telescope to study the heavens and ends by worshipping the lens. Fourth, the last reflection. Some days later we stood once more within the British Museum, where the rescued codices, both the charred original and Harcourt's translation, lay secured under glass. The curators had affixed a simple label, Early Studies in the Reflection of Light, Provenance Unknown. Holmes regarded them long in silence. Around us the great hall murmured with the quiet industry of scholars. Outside, the winter sun filtered pale through the high windows, scattering its rays upon the marble floor. At last he spoke. It is curious, Watson, how all human knowledge begins in darkness. We reach toward a spark, mistake it for the dawn, and kindle it into a flame that burns as much as it warms. The Brotherhood's tragedy is but an allegory of the race. And Merridew? I asked. He will live, I think, in peace, though not in reason. Perhaps he will pray to a quieter light. We walked slowly down the corridor. The polished floor caught our reflections, twin figures distorted in the marble's sheen. Holmes paused, studying the image. There we are, Watson. 2 more scholars kneeling before our own mirror. Let us hope we never mistake it for revelation. V. Epilogue. That evening, as the lamps were lit in Baker Street and the familiar comfort of our rooms enclosed us once again, Holmes sat at his desk writing the final entry of his report. He sealed it, addressed it to Lestrade, and laid it aside. Our work here is finished, he said quietly. The codex will trouble no one again. He reached for his violin and drew the bow across the strings. A low contemplative note filled the room, neither cheerful nor sad, but balanced upon that fine line where intellect meets humanity. The melody rose, faltered, and resolved into calm. Outside, the moon had climbed above the chimneys, serene and indifferent, its pale light glancing upon the window-pane. Holmes's music ceased. He looked toward it and smiled faintly. Light, Watson, he said, always light, the faithful adversary of darkness, yet never without shadow. And as the final chord faded into the fog beyond Baker Street, I knew that, whatever enigmas the future might hold, none would ever equal the strange, perilous beauty of the mystery we had come to call The Crypt Beneath the Library. Chapter 18. The Letters of Light. Though the affair of the Brotherhood had seemingly reached its quiet conclusion, fate, ever reluctant to leave Sherlock Holmes in peace, had contrived one final turn in the labyrinth. It began, as so many of our later adventures did, with the morning post. The letters arrive. It was the 2nd week of February. A thin, reluctant sunlight filtered through the fog, and the frost upon our window panes had etched arabesques of remarkable intricacy. Holmes, as was his habit after breakfast, had resumed his customary trance in the armchair opposite the fire, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, when Mrs. Hudson entered bearing a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. "For you, Mr. Holmes. Brought by hand from the British Museum," the messenger said. Holmes stirred at once, his eyes brightening with that peculiar gleam which to my practised eye signalled the reawakening of his mind to the chase. The museum," he murmured. The dead continued to correspond. He unwrapped the parcel. Within lay a bundle of yellowed papers tied with string, and a letter in an unfamiliar hand. Holmes read it aloud. "Sir, while cataloguing certain effects belonging to the late Edmund Harcourt, recently recovered from his private study, we discovered enclosed letters addressed to you by name. The envelopes were unsealed but never sent. As executor of the collection, I take the liberty of forwarding them. Their contents may prove of professional interest. Yours faithfully, Vernon Blake, British Museum." Holmes untied the string and spread the letters upon the table. The first bore a date but 3 days before Harcourt's death. "Listen, Watson," said he, and began to read. So, the voice of the dead. "My dear Mr. Holmes, I have long admired your method, which unites observation and reason in the service of truth. I fear I may soon have need of both. There are forces at work within the Aldwych Library of which even the police know nothing. For years I have served a society that calls itself the Brotherhood of St. Cyprian, believing it an antiquarian fellowship devoted to the preservation of rare manuscripts. Only lately have I learned that its true object is far darker. They worship not knowledge but the illusion of it. The Codex Selenis, which I am ordered to seal once more within the crypt, is in truth no holy book but a cipher of light, one I have begun to decipher. I have written to you because I believe they mean to silence me before I reveal what I have found. Should I fall, I trust your intellect to complete my task. Edmund Harcourt." Holmes laid the letter aside and drew in a long breath. The man foresaw his end with tragic clarity. He took up the second letter, dated the following day. "My dear sir, the key lies in reflection. Literally so. A beam of light, when passed through a polished surface, yields not merely illumination, but inversion. If my calculations be correct, the Codex is meant to be read only thus. The secret, however, is not merely optical, but moral, truth revealed only when reversed. Ad lumen ultimum, toward the final light, was never a promise of revelation, but a warning of blindness. If you receive this, you will understand. The cipher conceals a formula, not of theology, but of human vision itself. E.H. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Vision itself, Watson. The old scholar had come within an inch of solving the puzzle that consumed him. He opened the third and final letter. The handwriting was unsteady, the ink blotched, as though written in haste. "Mr. Holmes, I am watched. Tonight they descend to the crypt. I hear whispers through the floor. Yet I have hidden the true translation where no zealot will think to look, in the margins of my own commentary upon the Gospel of St. John. And the light shineth in darkness. So may reason survive superstition. If you find this, look to the light that falls from above, not beneath. There the equation will speak for itself." E.H. Holmes folded the letter slowly and stared into the fire. "The Gospel of St. John," he murmured. "Watson, you recall that Harcourt was also a theologian?" "Yes. He edited several commentaries. Then his hint is plain enough. The translation of the Codex Salenius lies concealed in one of his published volumes. I must see it at once. Third, the Gospel. According to Holmes. Within the hour we were at the British Museum, where Mr. Blake, ever obliging, conducted us to the reading room. The great rotunda echoed with the soft shuffle of scholars and the scratch of pens, that vast hive of intellect undisturbed by worldly tumult. From the archives he produced a single volume, Annotations upon the Fourth Gospel, by Edmund Harcourt, 1885. Holmes carried it to a desk beneath the dome, and began to turn the pages with a surgeon's delicacy. Note, Watson, the subtle irregularity of the paper. These marginal glosses are not printed but written by hand, ink added after publication. The man was hiding something in plain sight. He placed a mirror beside the open book, adjusting it until the light from the dome struck the page obliquely. The faint reflection revealed a series of dots and dashes running along the margin, invisible from any other angle. "Elementary cryptography," said he. "Harcourt has employed the lunar cipher once more. The same reflective principle. Let us translate." He copied the symbols, referring occasionally to the codex fragments, muttering under his breath. After half an hour he looked up, his face transfigured by a rare excitement. "Watson, this is astonishing. Harcourt has not left us a creed but a calculation, the ratio of perception to distance, expressed as a universal constant of illumination. He anticipated the psychological law of afterimage decades before our scientists named it. In effect, he proved that the eye retains light even when it is gone." "A metaphor?" I ventured. Holmes smiled. "A law. He demonstrated that vision does not end with sight, that memory itself is a reflection of light retained. The Brotherhood mistook it for mysticism. It was pure science." He leaned back, satisfaction mingled with something more reflective. "Harcourt died for a truth he had already found, and the men who killed him died, worshipping its shadow." Avod, the Last Temptation. As we left the museum, the winter twilight had fallen, a gauze of violet and gold over the city. Holmes paused upon the steps and drew the letters from his pocket. "Watson," said he softly, "do you ever consider how near a man may come to losing himself in pursuit of knowledge?" I laughed. "Often, when I watch you, Holmes." He smiled faintly. "Touché. Yet Harcourt's fate gives me pause. Had I been born a century earlier, I might have been numbered among those same fanatics, chasing the illusion of light into the abyss. There is a madness latent in the pure intellect, and it whispers always the same temptation, that to know is to be divine." He looked toward the fading sun. And yet, without that temptation, who would lift his eyes above the fog? We stood in silence, the city humming distantly around us. Then he turned abruptly, as though dismissing a private thought. "Come, my dear fellow. The cold is intolerable, and Mrs. Hudson's patience with our late dinners is not infinite." The light that remained. That evening found us once more before our hearth, the glow of the fire warming the room and the familiar clutter of cases and books about us. Holmes sat with the letters spread upon his knees, reading and rereading them as though they held the last word of some vast equation. At length he looked up. "You recall, Watson, the Reverend Merridew's final words. 'The light lives in me now.' Poor fool! Yet in his madness he uttered a truth. For light once seen does indeed live within us. Every observation, every deduction, every moment of perception leaves its trace upon the mind. That, I think, was Harcourt's real discovery. Not the reflection of light upon mirrors, but its reflection within ourselves." He rose, and for a long moment stood gazing into the fire. "Strange, is it not, that the farther one looks into darkness, the more light one finds?" I said nothing. There was a gravity in his tone that needed no answer. The flames flickered upon his face, carving it into sharp relief. The features of a man who, for all his brilliance, knew the peril of seeing too much. At last he turned, that familiar wry smile softening the lines of his face. "Watson," said he, "if ever you find me kneeling before a mirror, I beg you to strike it from my hands." I smiled. "You may depend upon it." He laughed quietly, the shadow passing from him. "Then let us be content with our mortal lanterns. There are still mysteries enough in London to occupy us without courting those of heaven." He drew the curtains and set the lamp upon the table, its modest glow filling the room with a steady, human warmth. And thus ended, as it had begun, in light and shadow, the strangest of all our adventures. The Crypt Beneath the Library. Chapter 2. The Constant of Illumination. In the months that followed the unearthing of Harcourt's final letters, I had hoped that the affair of the Codex Silenis would fade quietly into memory, leaving only a scholarly footnote in Holmes's vast catalogue of curiosities. But my friend's mind, once engaged upon a riddle that married the physical with the philosophical, could no more abandon it than a mathematician could forsake an incomplete proof. It was the beginning of March, the winter fogs lifting, the first faint promise of spring trembling in the air, when I realized that Holmes was again in the grip of that restless fervor which precedes his most remarkable discoveries. Holmes's new obsession. I returned from my morning rounds to find our sitting room transformed into a veritable laboratory. The curtains were drawn, the windows darkened with cloth, and the air thick with the mingled odors of lamp oil and heated glass. Upon the floor, chalk lines intersected in a complex lattice of geometric figures, while a variety of lenses, mirrors, and polished metal plates lay strewn about like the remains of some disordered astronomer's kit. At the center of this chaos stood Holmes, tall and spare, his dressing gown flung open like the robe of an alchemist, his lean face illuminated by the eerie blue light of a gas flame. "Good morning, Watson," said he without looking up. "You arrive at the most delicate moment. Stand there, yes, precisely there, and do not move a hair's breadth." I obeyed, though my patience was strained. "Might I inquire," I said, "whether you are recreating the optical cipher or constructing a death trap?" He smiled faintly, adjusting a lens until the light reflected upon the opposite wall. "Neither, my dear fellow, though both outcomes remain possible. I am testing Harcourt's theorem." "You mean the formula from his hidden notes?" "Precisely. He proposed a constant ratio between the persistence of visual impression and the intensity of reflected light, what he called the lumen coefficient. It is the measure, if you will, of how long the mind's eye retains an image after the physical light has vanished. If it holds, it will bridge the gulf between perception and physics. Imagine it, Watson, an equation that proves memory itself is but the afterglow of the world." He turned abruptly, his gaze alight with that fierce enthusiasm which, when it seized him, seemed to consume every trace of fatigue or hunger. "We shall prove it here. Tonight." Second. A demonstration of shadows. That evening, after Mrs. Hudson had cleared away our supper with a dubious shake of the head, Holmes prepared the apparatus anew. He had arranged upon the table a circular mirror of polished copper, a photographic plate, and a small clockwork mechanism fitted with a shutter. Upon the mantel he set one of his cherished violins, declaring that the experiment required vibration to measure time by sound as well as light. When all was ready, he dimmed the lamps until only the flame of a single candle remained. "Observe closely, Watson. The candle represents the visible stimulus, the mirror, the retina, the plate, the memory. When the shutter closes, the light ceases. But if Harcourt's constant be true, the afterimage should persist long enough to imprint a secondary reflection upon the plate. Ready?" I nodded. Holmes opened the shutter. The candle's glow flashed across the mirror and vanished as the mechanism snapped shut. The room fell into darkness. For a moment, we waited. Then, slowly, upon the photographic plate, a pale ghost of light began to appear, faint at first, then sharpening into the distinct outline of the candle flame. "Good Lord!" I exclaimed. "It remains!" Holmes's voice trembled with subdued triumph. Precisely. The light persists beyond its source. The coefficient holds. He measured the duration carefully by his stopwatch, then repeated the experiment several times, adjusting distances and intensities. Each time the spectral flame reappeared, lingering for the same measurable span before fading into blackness. It is the persistence of vision, Watson, the very mechanism by which film and illusion deceive the eye. But Harcourt saw further. He perceived that memory itself operates by the same principle. The mind, like the mirror, retains the light of experience after the moment has passed. He sank into his chair, exhaustion softening his voice. The Brotherhood worshipped their mirror as an oracle. Harcourt read it as a theorem. Between the two lies the whole gulf between superstition and science. Third, the visitor in the fog. Our satisfaction, however, was short-lived. It was near midnight when a knock sounded at the door. Soft, deliberate, unlike the impatient rapping of our usual clients. Holmes looked up sharply. "Were you expecting anyone, Watson?" "No." He crossed the room in silence and opened the door. A gust of cold fog swept in, revealing a cloaked figure standing upon the threshold. The visitor's hat brim concealed his features, but the voice that spoke was low and firm. "Mr. Holmes, I believe you have something which belongs to us." Holmes regarded him coolly. "If by us you refer to the late Brotherhood of St. Cyprian, I fear your claim rests upon ashes." The man stepped forward, lowering his hood. He was young, scholarly, with an ascetic face and eyes that burned with fanatic intensity. "I am their successor," he said. "The circle endures. You have rediscovered what others sought to destroy. The equation is not yours to reveal." Holmes's hand slipped toward his revolver upon the mantel. "You speak with confidence, sir. May I know your name?" "Call me what they called Harcourt, the Keeper of Light." At this strange utterance, the intruder drew from his cloak a small object, a disc of brass, twin to Mallory's medallion, its center fitted with an intact lens that gleamed even in the dimness. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "The second mirror," he whispered. The man smiled faintly. "Return the parchment, or London itself will bear witness to the last illumination." Before either of us could move, he flung the disc toward the apparatus upon the table. The lens struck the copper mirror. A burst of light, white, searing, unnatural, filled the room. I threw up my hands to shield my eyes, and in that instant the visitor vanished into the fog. When I recovered my sight, Holmes was already on his knees beside the apparatus, examining the shattered fragments. "No ordinary glass," he muttered. "Phosphoric salts, dangerous concentrations. He meant to destroy my work, but he has left us his trail." Third, pursuit through the city. Within minutes we were in pursuit, the night air biting our faces as we drove in a hansom through the winding streets toward the river. Holmes had found upon the brass disc a single engraving, a triangle within a circle, the insignia, he said, of an obscure printmaker's guild near Blackfriars, one that had once supplied engravings to the Brotherhood. We reached the old warehouse by the embankment just as the tide began to turn. The door hung ajar, a light flickering within. Holmes motioned me to silence, and we entered. Inside, amid the dust of old presses and stacks of yellowed paper, the young fanatic stood before a great mirror set upright upon a wooden frame. Upon its surface, some luminous pattern pulsed like the reflection of a distant flame. Holmes advanced. "Enough of this folly. Step away from the glass." The man turned, his eyes fever bright. "You cannot stop it. The formula must complete itself. The light reveals all." He pressed his hand to the mirror, and at once the radiance flared blindingly. The glass shuddered, cracked, and fell in a rain of shards. The figure gave a cry and collapsed among them. We rushed forward, but it was too late. The man lay still, the lens clutched in his hand. The light had died. Holmes stood over him, grave and silent. "He sought revelation," he said at last. He found extinction. Why? The equation of the mind. 2 days later, in the calm of Baker Street, Holmes completed the report for Lestrade. The young zealot had been identified as a junior chemist from the museum's own staff, a disciple of Mallory's who had recovered fragments of the second mirror. The phenomenon that killed him, Holmes explained, was nothing mystical, a violent chemical reaction of phosphorus under pressure. Yet the symbolism was irresistible. Holmes placed the codex and Harcourt's formula side by side upon his desk. "Do you see, Watson? The constant of illumination was never meant for ritual but for understanding. Light, knowledge, memory, all obey the same law, but when men worship the law instead of learning from it, the result is always the same: blindness." He turned to me with a rare gentleness. "Harcourt's discovery may one day find its rightful place in science. Until then, it will remain what it was, a ghost of reason wandering through the corridors of faith." Twilight in Baker Street. That night we dined together quietly. Outside the fog had cleared, and a thin crescent moon hung above the rooftops. Holmes sat by the window, the violin resting idle in his lap. "Do you know, Watson," he said, "I believe Harcourt was right in one regard. The mind retains its light longer than the eye perceives. Perhaps that is why memory endures after the lamp of life has gone out." He drew the bow across the strings, producing a note so soft and mournful that it seemed to blend with the faint murmur of the city beyond. Then, setting the instrument aside, he added with a smile that was half fatigue, half serenity, "The constant of illumination, a fitting title, do you not think? For it is reason itself that endures, even when all else fades." And as the fire dwindled and the last reflection of moonlight quivered upon the window-pane, I thought that in that quiet room, amid the smoke and shadows of Baker Street, the balance between darkness and enlightenment had, for that moment at least, been perfectly kept. Chapter 3. The Moon and the Mirror. It was on a night of calm and curious stillness, the air holding that peculiar quiet which often precedes the London fog, that the final chapter of the Codex Salinas affair began. The street lamps outside Baker Street shimmered like spectral orbs in the gathering mist, and within our familiar rooms Sherlock Holmes sat motionless before the fire, his violin resting silent across his knees. It had been 3 weeks since the tragedy at the Blackfriars warehouse, and though the case was officially concluded, I could see that Holmes's mind had not let it rest. The photograph. I was writing up the notes of a minor burglary we had lately solved when a firm knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, bearing a small parcel. "A messenger just now, Mr. Holmes. No address given. Said only that it was for your eyes alone." Holmes took it without comment. The wrapping was of plain brown paper, sealed with black wax bearing the faint impression of a pelican. I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "Ah," he said softly, "the Brotherhood leaves long shadows." He broke the seal. Inside was a stiff envelope containing a single photographic print. The paper was coarse, slightly singed at the edges, but the image itself was sharp and hauntingly clear. It showed the interior of a chamber, stone walls, vaulted ceiling, a dais of black marble. In the center stood the shattered bronze mirror we had seen in the crypt, its fragments reflecting a circle of candlelight. But what arrested my gaze was the faint outline of 2 figures in the reflection, indistinct, spectral, one tall and angular, the other shorter, half-turned. "Holmes," I breathed, "that's us." He did not answer at once. His keen eyes scanned the photograph from corner to corner, his fingers trembling slightly, a rare sign of excitement. "Yes," he said at last, "taken from the crypt, and yet impossible. No photographer was present, and the mirror was shattered before any exposure could be made. And look, Watson, the candlelight falls from above, not from the level of the floor. This was captured from the other mirror." "The second one?" "But it was destroyed." Holmes's voice sank almost to a whisper. "Or so we believed. This image could only exist if some remnant of that mirror yet endures, reflecting not light, but memory. Second, the investigation renewed. He rose, pacing the floor with quick, nervous steps. You recall my experiment with Harcourt's constant? If the human eye retains light after its source is gone, might not certain chemical surfaces retain it longer still? A mirror composed of phosphorescent salts could, in theory, record the impression of all that stood before it. We are looking, my dear Watson, at a photograph developed by time itself. I stared. You mean that this image lay dormant within the mirror for weeks, even years, and was somehow drawn forth? Precisely. The Brotherhood may have stumbled upon a primitive method of optical storage. Their worship of the reflected word was nothing less than the veneration of this property, the mirror as memory. He turned the photograph over. On the back, faintly penciled, were 2 words: "Return below." Holmes's eyes flashed. The crypt again. Whoever sent this believes something remains beneath the ruins, perhaps a survivor, perhaps a relic. He reached for his coat and revolver. Come, Watson. The night promises a final revelation. 3. Beneath the ruins. The old witch library had long since been cordoned off, its gutted shell looming like a charred skeleton against the fog. A single constable guarded the entrance who, recognizing Holmes, admitted us without question. Lanterns in hand, we descended once more into the earth, through fallen stone and corridors blackened by soot, until we stood at the edge of the collapsed crypt. Holmes examined the ground carefully, sweeping the beam of his lantern in slow arcs. Note the marks here. Bootprints, fresh, narrow-soled. Someone has been here within the day. A scholar's tread, not a laborer's. We followed the trail through a half-blocked passage that ended in a small alcove. There, upon a makeshift table of stone, lay a sheet of photographic paper spread flat beneath a cracked lens and a small chemical lamp, recently lit. Holmes bent low, his shadow stretching long upon the wall. An improvised dark room. Our mysterious correspondent developed the image here. The process is primitive, yet precise. And look, the remaining fragments of the mirror. Indeed, in a niche beside the lamp lay several shards of bronze-backed glass, their surfaces coated with a faint luminescent film. Even in darkness they glimmered like embers. Holmes lifted one with infinite care. "Still reactive," he murmured. "By heavens, Watson, Harcourt's constant again. The light retained by this surface could be coaxed forth under chemical excitation. This is the mirror's true secret." He placed the shard upon the table and angled the lamp across it. Slowly, shapes began to form, dim, wavering outlines like figures seen through mist. A face appeared, pallid and thin, its eyes fixed not upon us but outward, as though regarding something beyond the glass. Then another shape, a hand, extended as if in warning. Holmes stepped back, his features composed but pale. "Harcourt," he said softly. "The mirror remembers him." Fed, the voice of the light. We stood transfixed. The image wavered, flickered, and then, impossible though it seemed, a faint whisper filled the air, borne not through sound, but through the vibration of the lamp flame itself. It was as if the light spoke. Ad lumen ultimum. The same phrase that had haunted the entire affair, toward the last light. Holmes's voice, when he spoke, was steady but subdued. An echo. Chemical resonance amplified by heat. No ghost, Watson, but the final murmur of trapped vibration. The Brotherhood mistook science for spirit once more. Yet I saw, in the shifting glow of that strange reflection, something stir within my friend's face. Not fear, but an awe he would never confess. He reached out and with one swift motion turned down the lamp. The whisper ceased. The image vanished. "That will do," he said quietly. "The dead have spoken enough through light." V. The revelation. We returned to Baker Street before dawn, the fog thinning into a pearly haze. Holmes said little during the drive, and when at last we entered our rooms, he went directly to the desk and began to write. I watched him in silence until the pen stopped. He handed me a page filled with tight, precise script. The phenomenon of retained illumination confirms Harcourt's constant beyond doubt. The human mind, the photographic plate, and the phosphoric mirror are all governed by one law, that light, once absorbed, endures invisibly until rekindled by reflection. The implications reach beyond physics into philosophy. Memory itself is the universe remembering. Holmes leaned back, weary but content. It was never mysticism, Watson. It was nature recording herself. And the Brotherhood, he smiled faintly. Their faith, stripped of error, was not faith at all but curiosity, the noblest sin. They erred only in believing the mirror divine when it was merely obedient. He rose, crossed to the window, and drew aside the curtain. The first beams of morning fell across his face, softening its austere lines. Look, Watson, the moon still lingers though the sun has risen. Reflection and source together. The eternal dialogue. 6. Epilogue. The final reflection. That evening Holmes developed the photograph once more, under proper conditions. When the image dried, he pinned it above the mantel. Against the black marble of the hearth, our two ghostly figures seemed to hover forever upon the brink of revelation. Witnesses not of the supernatural, but of the mind's endless hunger for light. Holmes stood gazing at it, the pipe smoke curling upward in delicate spirals. "Do you see, Watson?" he said softly. "The mirror did not lie. It merely showed us what we were, observers trapped within our own reflection. Every mystery is but the universe looking back at itself," I asked, half in jest. "And are you content, Holmes, now that all has been revealed?" He smiled, that rare, quiet smile which belonged not to triumph but to understanding. Content? Hardly, but perhaps illuminated. He turned once more to the fire. The glow touched his lean face and glinted in his eyes, those grey mirrors of reason that, for all their brilliance, held depths I could never wholly fathom. Outside, London slept beneath its eternal shroud of fog, the moon sinking slowly into the river mist. And I, watching the thin plume of smoke rise from Holmes's pipe, could not help but think that somewhere, far beyond Baker Street, the last light still burned, reflected in the mind of the only man I have ever known who could gaze into darkness and find illumination. Chapter 14th. The Last Light Falls. It was upon a melancholy April evening, when the light hung low over the city like the dying embers of a fire, that the affair of the Codex Silenus at last drew to its end. The daffodils had begun to bloom in the gardens of Regent's Park, yet in our sitting room at Baker Street there lingered still the ghost of the crypt's phosphorescent glow, for upon the mantelpiece, in its frame of dark oak, hung that singular photograph, the moon and the mirror. I had grown accustomed to seeing it each day, its spectral figures, Holmes and myself, fixed forever in a tableau of inquiry and revelation. But to Holmes it had become something more, a problem unresolved, a question that reached beyond deduction into the realm of meaning itself. I, a restless mind. For several weeks my companion had shown signs of that nervous abstraction, which always presaged either a revelation or an illness. He spent long hours staring into the photograph or pacing the floor, pausing only to scrawl incomprehensible notes upon scraps of paper, which he then crumpled and consigned to the fire. One morning, finding him thus engaged, I ventured to speak. "My dear Holmes, you are wearing yourself to a shadow. Surely the affair is finished. The Brotherhood is dispersed, the science secured. What more remains?" He looked up, and the firelight caught the hollows of his cheeks, lending him an almost spectral aspect. "What remains, Watson," said he quietly, "is the question that cannot be written in any report. We have proved that light endures, that it may linger unseen until awakened by reflection. But what of thought itself? If the mind retains impressions beyond perception, might there be a point at which memory and matter are one and the same? I smiled, thinking he jested. You are venturing into metaphysics, my friend. Into physics, rather, he replied, pushed to its logical extreme. Harcourt's constant was not the end of the equation, it was its preface. He glimpsed what philosophers have only guessed, that consciousness may itself be the afterglow of the universe. He saw my perplexity and laughed softly. You see, Watson, even the greatest mysteries are born from the simplest observations. A candle burns, its light strikes the mirror, the image remains. So too the soul, perhaps, is but the reflection of life, persisting a moment after the flame has died. Second, the experiment at dawn. That evening Holmes astonished me by proposing a final experiment. I must know, said he, whether the principle extends to organic perception, whether the human eye, at the moment of its last illumination, records something of the world that cannot be erased. You speak as a physiologist might, I said, uneasy. Surely such an inquiry borders upon sacrilege. Sacrilege, he murmured, is only curiosity misunderstood. Before dawn we were at the small laboratory of a friendly anatomist in Bloomsbury, where Holmes had arranged to borrow certain instruments. He refused to tell me his full purpose until we stood in the dim room, lit only by the blue glow of a single gas jet. Upon the table lay a cataleptic corpse recently delivered from the hospital morgue. Holmes regarded it with scientific composure. The retina, said he, is but a living plate of silver salts. At the instant of death it may retain the final image upon its surface, the so-called optograph. If Harcourt's law is correct, that image should still be recoverable. I turned away, sickened by the thought, but Holmes proceeded with the utmost delicacy, applying a chemical wash to a small portion of the cornea and exposing it beneath a lamp. A faint blur emerged, dark against the frame, resolving slowly into the outline of a window and a bar of sunlight. He stepped back, awed. You see, even death remembers light. I could not answer. In that cold room the discovery seemed less triumph than revelation, and its implications filled me with a strange unease. Holmes replaced the instruments and covered the face reverently. We have confirmed the last fragment of Harcourt's theorem, he said softly. Light never dies. It merely changes its host. Third, the scholar's farewell. 2 days later a letter arrived bearing the seal of the British Museum. It was from Mr. Vernon Blake, the curator who had first brought us Harcourt's papers. The trustees, he wrote, had resolved to publish a small monograph on the Codex Selenis, and to credit Holmes's assistance in elucidating its scientific aspects. Enclosed was a proof of the frontispiece, the photograph of the crypt, reproduced in sepia. Holmes studied it for a long moment. They make an icon of reason, he murmured. It is the oldest superstition of all. He laid the image aside and turned to me with a weary smile. Do you recall Merridew's last words, Watson? The light lives in me now. Poor madman. Yet he spoke the truth. It lives in all of us, a spark of comprehension that neither faith nor folly can extinguish. But one must learn when to shade the lamp. That evening he wrote a brief note to Mr. Blake, declining the offered credit. The discovery, he said, belongs to the dead. Fourth, the night walk. The following night found us walking along the embankment, where the river glimmered beneath the moon like a slow artery of silver. Holmes was silent for a long while, his eyes fixed upon the reflection of the lights in the water. At times, he said at last, I feel as though London herself were a mirror, each window a fragment, each human face a reflection of some larger illumination. The Brotherhood worshipped beneath the earth, yet all they sought lay above their heads. Harcourt saw it and paid the price. He turned to me suddenly. Do you ever tire, Watson, of chasing light through shadows? I smiled. Never while I have you to follow. He laughed, a low, genuine laugh that rang softly against the water. Ah, my dear fellow, you are the only constant in my own illumination. V. The last light falls. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the city glistening after a night's rain. Holmes had resumed his normal spirits. He even took pleasure in playing the violin, filling our rooms with the bright resonance of Mozart. When he finished, he set the instrument aside and poured himself a cup of coffee. "There is a serenity in closure," he said. "The Codex Silenius is laid to rest, and with it a chapter of superstition. Let the scientists quarrel over its equations. We have done our part." He leaned back, a faint smile upon his lips. "And yet I confess, there are moments when I miss the mystery, when the darkness seems almost a friend. Without shadow, light is mere glare." As he spoke, the sunlight caught the framed photograph above the hearth. For an instant it flared brilliantly, the figures within seeming to move. Or perhaps it was only the play of the flame. Holmes looked up, his eyes narrowing in amusement. "Even the mirror remembers," he said softly. Then he rose, opened the window, and let the sunlight flood the room. The fog retreated before it, and the familiar world, the hansom cabs, the cries of newsboys, the clatter of hoofs, came alive once more. He turned to me with that expression I had come to know so well, part irony, part wonder, and wholly human. "Come, Watson. There will be other cases, other puzzles. The world, thank heaven, is not yet fully illuminated." 6. Epilogue. The Light. Beyond years have passed since that morning, yet even now when I think of Holmes, it is always in that moment that I see him. Standing by the window, the sun upon his face, the shadow of the Codex forever behind him. He was, in truth, what he had so often sought to explain, the living proof that reason and mystery are but reflections of the same light. And if, as some philosophers claim, all memory is illumination retained, then somewhere in the great mirror of time, his image endures still, calm, keen-eyed, and waiting beside the fire at Baker Street, the smoke of his pipe rising through the golden haze like the spirit of inquiry itself. Chapter 15. The Casebook Epilogue. Watson's final reflections on the case of the crypt, beneath the library. It is a peculiar fate, dear reader, and I write now in the solitude of advancing age, that the one case which most profoundly altered my understanding of the world should remain the least known among those adventures I shared with my remarkable friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. The official records speak only of a fire in the Aldwych Library, and the unfortunate death of certain men of learning. The truth, as you have now read it, lies far deeper, beneath the stones of London, beneath the illusions of science and faith, and beneath the very mind of man. I have long debated whether these pages ought to see print at all. Yet as I sit by the fire in my quiet Kensington study, I find myself hearing again the low murmur of Holmes's voice, the rustle of his dressing gown as he paced before the hearth, and that unforgettable phrase spoken in half jest, half prophecy, "Light, Watson, always light." And so I commit to paper this closing testament, not as a sensational tale, but as a remembrance of the friend whose mind shone brighter than the lamps of Baker Street, and whose humanity, though often hidden beneath irony and logic, was never extinguished. Aye, the dust of time years have passed since those perilous nights beneath the Aldwych Library. The city itself has changed beyond recognition. The once foggy lanes of Fleet Street blaze now with electric light, and the domes of the new buildings gleam where soot once lay thick. London has become its own illumination, brilliant, tireless, sleepless. Yet in the midst of all this brightness I find myself haunted not by the lamps above, but by the soft glow that lingered upon that broken mirror, the faint remembered gleam that Holmes called the constant of illumination. I begin to wonder if he was right, that what we call memory is but a reflection of all we have once seen, held within us until we ourselves fade. I returned once to Baker Street some years after Holmes's departure for Sussex. The rooms were smaller than I recalled, the air still carrying the ghostly trace of tobacco and chemicals. Upon the mantel hung the old framed photograph, The Moon and the Mirror, which Mrs. Hudson had kept in reverent dust. The figures within it seemed more spectral than ever. Two men caught between reason and revelation, unaware that they had themselves become part of the light they studied. I confess I stood there for a long time, as though waiting for one of those shadows to stir. 2. Letters from Sussex. From time to time Holmes wrote to me from his small farm upon the downs, where he had retired to what he termed the study of nature unadorned by mankind. His letters were brief, precise, and curiously tranquil. One, written in his neat, slanting hand, I preserve even now. My dear Watson, I have found in the slow workings of the hive the same principles that governed the Brotherhood's folly, order mistaken for divinity. The bees obey light, yet they do not worship it. Perhaps there lies the truer wisdom. As for myself, I have grown content to be the shadow of my former brilliance. A shadow, after all, is only another shape of light. Yours ever, S.H. I could almost hear his dry laughter in that final line. When next I visited him, I found him older, yet strangely softened. His violin stood in the corner. The magnifying glass was gone. "I use it now," he said, "only to study the wings of moths." We spoke little of the Codex Selenis, though once, as we watched the sun sink into the sea, he remarked, "The truest mirrors, Watson, are not of glass, but of conscience. One must learn to polish them from within." It was, I think, the nearest he ever came to a confession of faith. 3rd. The passing of the light. In the autumn of 1910, I received a telegram that Holmes had taken ill. By the time I reached Sussex, the housekeeper met me at the door with quiet eyes. He had passed peacefully that morning, seated by his window, the open letter of some half-written note before him. Upon the desk lay a small wooden box neatly labeled for Dr. Watson. Inside I found 3 objects: a lens carefully wrapped, a sheet of parchment covered in Holmes's handwriting, and the photograph of the crypt, its once bright tones now faded to sepia. The note, written in his familiar hand, read only, "My dear fellow, you were the truest reflection of all that was best in me. Keep the light burning, but let it never blind you. S.H. I will not deny that I wept freely for the first time in many years." The world seemed colder that day, though the sun shone brilliantly upon the downs. 4. The last experiment. In the twilight of my own life, I have sometimes sought to repeat his experiment with light. Not the scientific one, but the moral. To look upon the world and see within it the reflection of something enduring. I have found it in the eyes of my grandchildren, in the kindness of strangers, and even in the quiet courage of those who suffer. Perhaps that is what Holmes meant when he said that illumination and compassion are but different expressions of the same energy. The Brotherhood mistook knowledge for power. Harcourt mistook curiosity for salvation. But Holmes, at the last, understood that truth without humanity is a candle without warmth. The lens he left me still lies upon my desk. Sometimes, when the evening light strikes it just so, it casts upon the wall a faint circle, pale, steady, unchanging. I call it the last light. V. Closing reflections. If these pages should one day find their way into the hands of readers who know Holmes only through the legend of his deductions and the theatre of crime, let them understand that behind every mystery he solved, there lay another, the mystery of the human spirit. He pursued truth as others pursue faith, and in so doing he became the rarest of men, a scientist with a soul. For myself, I can say only this, that to have stood beside him, to have shared even a fraction of that light, was the greatest privilege of my life. The memory endures, as Harcourt foresaw, not his brilliance, but his reflection. And when, in the quiet hours before sleep, I see again the silhouette of my friend bending over his instruments, his lean face lit by the glow of discovery, I like to think that somewhere, beyond the limits of sight, he continues his endless investigation, following the trail of reason into the infinite, where light and shadow are one. Chapter 15. The Deduction. Eternal. a coda to the case of the crypt beneath the library. It is a curious thing, how memory lingers not in the great moments of triumph or peril, but in those quiet instants when the soul stands still. I have written of our adventures, of the chases through London fog, the cries of terror, the brilliant flashes of deduction that made Sherlock Holmes the marvel of his age. Yet of all the memories that remain, it is none of these that visits me most often now. It is the silence of Baker Street after the day's excitement, the steady glow of the lamp, and the calm voice that would break it only to say, "The game is afoot." Now the game has long been ended, and yet as I pen these last lines, I find that the silence is not emptiness, but echo, an echo of thought, of friendship, and of light. Ysera the pilgrimage. It was in the spring of 1912 that I made my final journey to Sussex. The years had not been kind to me. The old wound in my leg ached with every step, and my sight, once keen enough to follow Holmes's smallest gesture, had begun to blur around the edges. Yet something, perhaps gratitude, perhaps duty, drew me once more to the downs where he had spent his last peaceful years. The cottage was empty now, its whitewashed walls weathered by salt and time. Bees moved lazily through the air, their hum like the drone of a distant organ. A kindly farmer guided me to the small grave that lay behind the garden, a simple stone, unadorned save for a single line in Latin, chosen by Holmes himself. Lux ex tenebrae, light from darkness. I stood long before it, leaning upon my cane, the sea wind lifting the brim of my hat. The cliffs beyond gleamed like polished ivory under the afternoon sun. For a time, I could almost imagine that he was there beside me, long coat fluttering, eyes bright with speculation, explaining the stratification of the chalk or the flight of the gulls as though they were clues in a cosmic case. At length I removed from my pocket the small brass lens he had bequeathed me. The glass was clouded now, but when I tilted it toward the sunlight, a faint circle of brilliance leapt forth upon the stone, a perfect halo of illumination that trembled, then steadied. "Your last experiment, Holmes," I murmured, "and it still holds." Second, the vision on the downs. As the sun declined, I seated myself upon the low wall overlooking the sea. The sky deepened to gold, and the waves below caught the light in broken mirrors. I do not know whether it was the play of the reflection, the weariness of age, or something more mysterious, but as I gazed across that horizon, I seemed to see again the outline of a man walking slowly along the shore. He moved with the same measured stride I knew so well, his hands clasped behind his back, his head inclined as though in thought. The wind stirred his coat, and for an instant the setting sun flashed upon his profile, sharp, austere, unmistakable. "Holmes," I whispered. He paused, looked up, and though the distance was great, I could swear that he smiled. Then the light shifted, and he was gone. Was it illusion? My reason tells me yes. My heart, however, insists otherwise, and perhaps, as Holmes himself might have said, both are right. Third, the final note. I returned to London soon after, carrying the lens and the photograph of the crypt. In the twilight of my years, I took to writing these recollections, not to revive old fame, but to preserve a truth that is less about mystery than about understanding. For if Holmes taught me anything, it was that every deduction, no matter how complex, leads at last to a single proposition, that all things are connected, and that knowledge, true knowledge, is but sympathy illuminated. When I finished the final page, I laid down my pen and opened the curtains. The fog of evening had gathered once more, shrouding the city in silver. Somewhere a church bell tolled the hour, and from a distant alley came the cry of a newsboy. London had changed, yet it was the same eternal organism my friend had loved to dissect with his incomparable mind. Upon my desk lay the photograph, faded almost to invisibility. The two figures, Holmes and Ios, had grown faint, but not vanished. Their light, however pale, endured. 4. The deduction eternal. I sometimes wonder in the quiet of the night whether the universe itself is one great case, a mystery whose clues are scattered among the stars, awaiting the mind capable of assembling them. If so, then I like to think that somewhere beyond our ken, Holmes continues his investigation, tracing the pattern of constellations as though they were fingerprints, weighing the dust of comets for motive, testing the logic of creation itself. And when, in my dreams, I join him there, he greets me with that same familiar nod and says, "You see it now, Watson?" Elementary. Then the stars grow brighter, and the fog lifts. And for a moment, only a moment, I understand. V. Farewell to Baker Street. And so I end this chronicle, not with grief but with gratitude. The rooms at Baker Street are long let to strangers, the violin is silent, the armchair by the fire stands empty. Yet to me they remain occupied, not by ghosts, but by light. The light of reason, of friendship, of that curious love between two men who together sought truth amid the world's shadows. If these words reach any reader in some distant age, let them remember that deduction is not merely the science of evidence, but the art of seeing, and that behind every fact lies the reflection of a human soul. For as Holmes once said, gazing into the flame that first revealed the Codex Silenis, "Light endures, Watson. Only the lamps change." And with that thought I close this final casebook, content in the knowledge that though the last light has fallen upon Baker Street, its reflection, like memory, like friendship, is eternal.